Hello friends. About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you all. My name is Thomas Garcia, and I am 76 years old now. But the events I'm about to recount happened to me on October 15th, 1992, when I was just 44. It's a story that has haunted me for over 3 decades, one that I've rarely shared due to fear of disbelief or ridicule. But as I approach the twilight of my life, I feel compelled to put it down in writing, to leave a record of what I experienced in those fateful days in the Pinolino Mountains of Arizona. Back then, I was a different man, younger, of course, but also more carefree and adventurous. I worked as a middle manager at a paper company in Phoenix, a job that paid the bills but did little to satisfy my wanderlust. To combat the monotony of my 9-to-5 existence, I developed a passion for solo camping trips. There was something about the solitude of nature that rejuvenated my spirit in a way nothing else could. My vehicle of choice for these excursions was an old Winnebago, a beat-up 78 model I'd bought second-hand a few years back. It wasn't much to look at, with its faded beige exterior and the occasional rust spot, but it was my ticket to freedom. I'd lovingly restored much of the interior, replacing the worn-out upholstery and fixing up the kitchenette. It wasn't fancy, but it was home away from home. For months, I'd been planning this particular trip to the Pinolino Mountains. It's a beautiful spot, not too popular with tourists, which is just how I like it. I'd saved up my vacation days, squirreling them away like a miser hoarding gold coins. By the time October rolled around, I had a full week to spend in the wilderness. My preparations were meticulous. I stocked up on canned goods, filled a cooler with enough beer to last the week, and then some, and packed a stack of old paperback novels, mostly westerns and mystery thrillers. I made sure my first aid kit was fully stocked and double-checked all my camping gear. I even splurged on a new sleeping bag, anticipating the chilly autumn nights in the mountains. Originally, my buddy Carl Benton was supposed to join me. We'd been friends since high school, and he shared my love for the outdoors. We'd been on countless camping trips together over the years, swapping stories around the campfire and solving the world's problems over cans of cheap beer. But a week before we were set to leave, Carl called with the news that his wife, Linda, was expecting their first child. She was having a difficult pregnancy, and Carl, understandably, didn't want to leave her alone. "I'm sorry, Tom," he'd said over the phone, his voice a mixture of excitement and regret. "You know I'd be there if I could, but—" "Don't sweat it, Carl," I'd replied, trying to hide my disappointment. "Family comes first. We'll catch the next one together." So on the morning of October 12th, 1992, I set out alone in my trusty Winnebago. The drive from Phoenix to the Pinolino Mountains took about 4 hours, but I was in no rush. I took my time, enjoying the changing landscape as urban sprawl gave way to desert, and eventually to the pine-covered foothills of the mountains. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached my destination, a secluded campsite I'd discovered on a previous trip. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a bubbling creek nearby. I parked the Winnebago, took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, and felt the stress of city life begin to melt away. That first evening, as I sat by my campfire nursing a cold beer, I had no idea of the terror that awaited me in the days to come. If I had known, would I have turned back? Would I have fled to the safety of civilization? I'd like to think not, that the man I was then would have faced the unknown with courage. But the truth is, I don't know. What I do know is that the events that unfolded in that quiet mountain clearing would change me forever, leaving me with questions that have haunted me for over 30 years. The first couple of days of my camping trip were nothing short of idyllic. I fell into a comfortable routine, waking with the sun, brewing a pot of strong coffee over the campfire, and spending my mornings exploring the surrounding wilderness. The Pinolino Mountains in autumn were a feast for the senses. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. The trees were ablaze with red and gold leaves, and the only sounds were the rustling of wind through the branches and the occasional call of a bird. I'd spend hours hiking the mountain trails, my trusty Nikon camera around my neck, capturing the beauty of my surroundings. Sometimes I'd bring along my fishing rod and try my luck in the creek that ran near my campsite. I wasn't much of an angler, but I managed to catch a couple of decent-sized trout, which I cooked over the fire, savoring the taste of my own little victory against nature. In the evenings, I'd settle into my folding chair by the fire, a beer in one hand and a dog-eared Louis L'Amour novel in the other. As darkness fell and the stars came out, I'd look up at the vast expanse of the night sky, marveling at the Milky Way stretching across the heavens. It was in moments like these that I felt truly at peace, connected to something larger than myself. But on the third night, October 15th, things started to change. I remember the date clearly because it was the anniversary of my father's death, and I'd spent some time that evening reminiscing about him, wishing he could have seen this beautiful place. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick and lost in thought, when I heard something rustling in the bushes behind me. At first I didn't think much of it. The woods were full of life after all, and I'd seen plenty of deer and raccoons during my hikes. But there was something about the sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was too deliberate, too heavy to be a small animal. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the underbrush, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to turn back to the fire, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something large had darted behind a tree, just at the edge of my vision. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the night. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked to the edge of the clearing, shining my flashlight into the woods. The shadows seemed to dance and shift in the unsteady light, but I saw nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and say, "There, that's what I heard." After a few minutes of peering into the darkness, I returned to my chair, feeling foolish. "You're letting your imagination run wild, old man," I muttered to myself, taking a long swig of beer. But try as I might, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned in early that night, locking myself in the Winnebago and drawing all the curtains. It took me a long time to fall asleep, and when I did, my dreams were troubled, filled with shapeless shadows and the sound of heavy footsteps. The next morning, I woke to a beautiful, crisp autumn day. The events of the night before seemed silly in the bright light of day, and I chided myself for getting spooked over nothing. But as I stepped out of the RV, stretching and breathing in the cool mountain air, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth around my campsite, were footprints. But these were like no footprints I'd ever seen before. They were large, much too big for a person, with long, almost finger-like toes. My first thought was that it must be a bear, but I'd seen bear tracks before, and these were different. The shape was all wrong, more elongated, almost human-like, but grotesquely distorted. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and there, to flee back to the safety of civilization. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to adventure and mystery, was intrigued. What could have made these tracks? What kind of creature was out there in the woods? In the end, curiosity won out over caution. I took out my disposable camera and snapped several photos of the tracks, thinking they'd make for an interesting story to share with Carl when I got back. Then, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, I set out to explore the area, determined to find some explanation for what I'd seen. Little did I know I was taking the first steps down a path that would lead me into the heart of a mystery and a terror beyond anything I could have imagined. As the day wore on, I found myself unable to shake the unease that had settled over me. The strange footprints I'd discovered that morning haunted my thoughts, their impossible shape defying any rational explanation. I tried to distract myself with my usual activities, hiking, reading, tending to my campsite, but my mind kept circling back to those tracks and the rustling I'd heard in the night. That evening, I decided to stay closer to the RV. I told myself it was because I was tired from my morning hike, but deep down, I knew it was fear keeping me tethered to the relative safety of my campsite. I fired up the small propane grill I'd brought along and cooked some hot dogs, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. As I sat in my folding chair, attempting to lose myself in one of the Western novels I'd brought along, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear a snap of a twig or the crunch of leaves from the surrounding woods. Each time I'd look up, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything out of the ordinary. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. As darkness fell, I built up my campfire, taking comfort in its warmth and light. But as the night deepened, so did my sense of unease. The woods seemed different somehow, the familiar sounds of nocturnal animals conspicuously absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I heard it again. That same rustling sound from the night before. This time it was louder, more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the circle of light cast by my fire. My heart racing, I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining the beam towards the source of the noise. For a split second, no more than the blink of an eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of two glowing eyes reflecting the light of my flashlight. They were set high off the ground, much higher than any animal I knew of, and they seemed to shine with an unnatural, almost intelligent light. As quickly as I'd seen them, the eyes disappeared, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the pounding of my heart and the cold sweat on my brow told me it had been real. Whatever was out there in the woods, it was no ordinary animal. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, my hunting knife close at hand. I kept the fire burning high and bright, hoping its light would keep whatever was out there at bay. Sleep was out of the question. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me jumping, my eyes straining to penetrate the darkness beyond my little circle of light. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I'd made it through the night. But as the shadows retreated and I surveyed my campsite in the growing light, I saw something that made my heart sink. There, in the soft earth at the edge of the clearing, were more of those strange, elongated footprints. Whatever had been watching me in the night had come close, terrifyingly close, while I'd sat there, blind and vulnerable in the firelight. I knew then that I couldn't stay. Every instinct was screaming at me to pack up and leave, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I stood there, staring at those impossible footprints, a different impulse took hold. I'd come here seeking adventure, hadn't I? And now, for better or worse, I'd found it. With a mixture of fear and determination, I made a decision. I wouldn't run, not yet. Instead, I would try to uncover the truth behind what was happening in these woods. Little did I know, this decision would lead me down a path of discovery and terror that would change my life forever. After a sleepless night, I spent the morning debating my next move. Part of me, the rational, self-preserving part, was urging me to pack up and leave, to put this whole unsettling experience behind me. But there was another part, driven by a mixture of curiosity and stubborn pride, that couldn't bear the thought of leaving without answers. In the end, curiosity won out. I decided to explore the area where I'd seen those glowing eyes the night before. I packed a day bag with water, some trail mix, my camera, and my hunting knife. As an afterthought, I also threw in a can of bear spray. I knew deep down that whatever was out there probably wasn't a bear, but the weight of the can in my pack was oddly comforting. I set out mid-morning, the autumn sun climbing high in a clear blue sky. The woods were beautiful, the trees resplendent in their fall colors, but I found it hard to appreciate the scenery. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig had me on edge, my eyes constantly scanning the forest around me. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The ground was soft from recent rain, and those strange, elongated footprints were clearly visible. They led away from my campsite, deeper into the woods. With my heart in my throat, I began to follow them. For about an hour I tracked the footprints through the forest. They seemed to meander aimlessly at times, circling back on themselves or veering off in unexpected directions. But gradually I realized they were leading me up a gentle slope, away from the creek and into a denser, older part of the forest. The trees here were massive, their trunks gnarled and twisted with age. The canopy above was so thick that little sunlight penetrated, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The air felt different here too, heavier somehow, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Just as I was considering turning back, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. There, nestled in a small clearing, was an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, maybe decades. The windows were shattered, jagged shards of glass clinging to rotted frames. The door hung crookedly from rusted hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but I'd come too far to back out now. I had to know what secrets this place held. The interior of the cabin was a scene of decay and abandonment. A thick layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by the small animal tracks that crisscrossed the floor. What little furniture remained was broken and rotting. A collapsed table, the remnants of what might have been a chair, a rusted metal bed frame. But it was the far wall that truly caught my attention. Carved into the wood were strange symbols, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They didn't resemble any alphabet or writing system I was familiar with. Instead, they seemed almost organic, twisting and intertwining in complex patterns that hurt my eyes to look at for too long. I pulled out my camera and began snapping pictures, my hand shaking slightly as I did so. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but I knew it was important. These carvings, this cabin, they were connected somehow to the creature I'd glimpsed in the night. I was sure of it. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, partially hidden under a pile of moldy leaves and debris, was the edge of what looked like a trap door. My heart raced as I knelt down to clear away the detritus. Sure enough, there it was, a wooden trap door, its surface worn smooth by time and use. For a moment I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, warning me of the dangers that could lie below. But my curiosity, that same driving force that had led me this far, wouldn't let me walk away. With trembling hands, I grasped the iron ring set into the wood and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a yawning darkness below. The musty smell of damp earth and decay wafted up, making me gag slightly. I shone my flashlight down, revealing a crude ladder descending into a small earthen chamber. Taking a deep breath to steel my nerves, I began to climb down. The ladder creaked ominously under my weight, but held. As I reached the bottom, I swept my flashlight around, taking in my surroundings. The chamber was small, no more than 10 feet across. The walls were earthen, reinforced with old, rotting timbers. But it was what was in the center of the room that made my blood run cold. There, occupying most of the floor space, was a large stone altar. Its surface was stained dark, and I didn't want to think too hard about what might have caused those stains. More of those strange symbols were carved into its sides, seeming to writhe and twist in the unsteady beam of my flashlight. On the walls, crude paintings depicted scenes that turned my stomach. They showed grotesque, misshapen figures engaged in what looked like ritual activities. And towering over these figures in each scene was a larger entity, its form indistinct but unmistakably menacing. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving across the floor of the cabin above me. Panic seized me. I quickly switched off my flashlight, plunging myself into total darkness. I pressed myself against the earthen wall, hardly daring to breathe as I listened to the movements above. The footsteps crossed the cabin slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something. They paused near the trapdoor, and for a heart-stopping moment, I was sure it was about to open. But then they moved away, crossing back to the cabin door. I waited in the darkness for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. When I was sure the coast was clear, I cautiously made my way back up the ladder, my every movement painfully slow and quiet. The cabin was empty when I emerged, but I didn't linger. I ran, faster than I'd ever run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that accursed cabin as possible. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was setting. I was scratched, bruised, and utterly exhausted, but I didn't stop to rest. I threw my belongings haphazardly into the Winnebago, not caring about organization or damage. Within minutes I was on the road, driving perhaps a bit too fast down the winding mountain paths. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Phoenix hours later that I finally allowed myself to relax. As the familiar lights of the city came into view, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was safe. I had escaped. But as I drove through the quiet suburban streets towards my home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The things I'd seen, the mysteries I'd uncovered, they wouldn't simply disappear because I'd left them behind in those mountains. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that someday I would have to return. Someday, I would have to face the truth about what lurked in the shadows of the Pinolino Mountains. The entity I'd come to think of as the Hightail, a name that came to me in my nightmares in the weeks that followed, wasn't finished with me yet. As I pulled into my driveway, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon, I made a silent vow. I would prepare. I would research. And when the time came, I would be ready to uncover the full truth of the Hightail, no matter the cost. Little did I know then how high that cost would be, or how deeply the mystery of the Hightail would come to define the rest of my life. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. It's been over 3 decades since that fateful camping trip, and not a day goes by that I don't think about what happened in those woods. I've spent years researching, trying to find any information about the strange symbols I saw, or the creature I glimpsed. I've reached out to historians, anthropologists, even paranormal investigators, but answers remain elusive. I did go back to the Pinolino Mountains several times over the years, but I never found that cabin again. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, taking its secrets with it. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if it was all just a vivid hallucination brought on by fear and isolation. But then I look at the photos I took, the footprints, the symbols on the cabin wall, and I know it was real. I've heard whispers over the years, stories of other encounters in those mountains, hikers gone missing, strange sightings reported by campers. But nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and say, there, that proves what I saw. As I sit here now, an old man nearing the end of his days, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever know the truth. What was the Hightail? Where did it come from? And why did it let me go that night when it could have easily caught me? These questions haunt me still, but I take comfort in knowing that by sharing my story, I might inspire others to look deeper, to question the world around them. Because if there's one thing I've learned in all these years, it's that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we could ever imagine. And somewhere out there, in the deep, dark woods of the Pinolino Mountains, something is waiting, watching, biding its time. The Hightail, or whatever it truly is still out there, and someday someone will uncover the truth. I only hope they're more prepared for what they find than I was. This is Thomas Garcia signing off. Remember, the truth is out there. You just have to be brave enough or foolish enough to look for it. My name is Michael Martinez, and I am 71 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 14, 2003, but its repercussions have echoed through the years, haunting me to this day. I've always loved camping, ever since I was a kid growing up in the suburbs of Denver. There's something about the quiet of the wilderness, the crackle of a campfire, and the stars overhead that just feels right. It's a connection to nature that I've cherished all my life. So when I finally retired from my job as a high school history teacher and bought myself a modest RV, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I'd been saving up for years, dreaming of the day when I could hit the open road and explore the great outdoors at my own pace. The RV wasn't anything fancy, a 2000 Winnebago Adventurer, 35 feet long, with a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and enough space for me and a friend or two. It was perfect for what I had in mind. I decided to take it out for a week-long trip to a spot I'd found while researching online, a secluded area near the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. It was about a 6-hour drive from my home in Denver, but I figured it would be worth it for the solitude and natural beauty. I didn't want to go alone, though. As much as I loved the idea of solo camping, at my age, it seemed wise to have someone along, just in case. That's when I thought of my old friend Dave Whitman. We'd been thick as thieves back in college, roommates all 4 years at the University of Colorado. After graduation, life had taken us in different directions, me into teaching, him into accounting. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, but it had been a good 5 years since we'd last seen each other face to face. I gave Dave a call on a whim, not really expecting him to be free or interested. To my surprise and delight, he jumped at the chance. "Mike, old buddy," he'd exclaimed over the phone, his voice warm with nostalgia. "A camping trip? In an RV? Hell yes, I'm in. When do we leave?" We set the date for July 14th, a Monday. I figured leaving early in the week would mean fewer crowds at the campsite. The night before our departure, I barely slept. It wasn't just excitement keeping me up. There was a strange sense of anticipation, almost foreboding, that I couldn't quite shake. I chalked it up to pre-trip jitters and the natural anxiety that comes with age. The morning of the 14th dawned clear and bright. I was up before the sun, double-checking my supplies and making sure the RV was in good shape. I'd stocked up on all the essentials, plenty of food, water, first aid supplies, and of course, beer. Can't go camping without beer after all. Dave arrived at my place around 5 a.m., right on time. He looked good for 69, a little heavier than in our college days, his hair more salt than pepper, but his eyes still had that mischievous twinkle I remembered so well. "Ready for an adventure, Mikey?" He grinned, using the old nickname from our university days. I laughed, feeling some of my anxiety melt away. "You bet, Davy boy. Hop in, we've got a long drive ahead of us." As we pulled out of my driveway, the sky was just beginning to lighten with the promise of dawn. The streets of Denver were quiet, most of the city still asleep. It felt like we were embarking on a secret mission, sneaking away while the world slumbered. The drive was pleasant, filled with catching up and reminiscing. Dave told me about his grandkids, showing me pictures on his flip phone. I filled him in on my life since retirement, the volunteer work I'd been doing at the local library, the garden I'd started. It was comfortable, easy, like no time had passed at all. As we crossed into Wyoming, the landscape changed. The rolling plains gave way to more rugged terrain, hinting at the mountains to come. We stopped for lunch at a small diner in Casper, splitting a plate of biscuits and gravy that was so good it nearly brought tears to our eyes. "Just like Mom used to make," Dave said, patting his stomach contentedly. It was mid-afternoon when we finally reached our destination. The turnoff from the main road was easy to miss, just a small dirt track leading into the trees. I navigated the RV carefully, mindful of the uneven ground and low-hanging branches. After about a mile, the trees opened up into a small clearing next to a burbling creek. It was perfect, secluded, beautiful, with plenty of flat ground for the RV and our campsite. "Will you look at that?" Dave whispered, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The creek sparkled invitingly, and in the distance we could see the peaks of mountains rising against the sky. We set about making camp, falling into an easy rhythm. Dave set up the awning and outdoor furniture while I got the inside of the RV sorted. By the time the sun was setting, we had a cozy little setup. 2 camp chairs by a freshly dug fire pit, the RV providing a comforting presence at our backs. As night fell, we sat by the fire, cracking open our first beers of the trip. The stars came out, more than I'd seen in years. Away from the city lights, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of diamonds. "To old friends and new adventures," Dave said, raising his beer in a toast. I clinked my can against his, smiling. "To old friends and new adventures." We sat in companionable silence for a while, just enjoying the night and each other's company. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing up into the dark. In the distance, an owl hooted softly. "You know," Dave said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "I'm glad you called me, Mike. I needed this. Getting away from it all, I mean." I looked over at him, noting the lines of stress around his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "Everything okay, Dave?" He sighed, taking a long pull from his beer before answering. You know how it is. Work's been stressful. The firm's talking about downsizing, and at my age, well, let's just say I'm not feeling too secure." I nodded sympathetically. Even though I was retired, I remembered all too well the stress of work, the constant worry about job security. I'm sorry to hear that, Dave. Is there anything I can do? He shook his head, smiling ruefully. Nah, but thanks for asking. Just being out here, away from it all. It helps, puts things in perspective. We lapsed back into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As I stared into the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond our little circle of light. I told myself it was just my imagination, the natural wariness that comes from being in an unfamiliar place. If only I had known then what I know now. If only I had listened to that little voice of warning in the back of my mind. But I didn't. I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to too many horror movies and an overactive imagination. As we doused the fire and headed into the RV for the night, I had no idea that our peaceful camping trip was about to take a turn into territory darker and more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The horrors that awaited us in the coming days would change our lives forever, leaving scars that would never fully heal. But for that night at least, we slept peacefully, lulled by the sound of the creek and the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. It was the last truly restful night we would have for a long, long time. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I woke early, as I often do these days. The habits of a lifetime of early rising for work are hard to break, even in retirement. I lay in my bunk for a while, listening to Dave's soft snores from the other end of the RV and the cheerful songs of birds outside. Eventually, I got up, careful not to wake Dave. I put on a pot of coffee and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. The clearing looked different in the early light, softer somehow, draped in tendrils of mist that rose from the creek. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed something odd. Near the edge of our campsite, where the clearing met the dense forest, several branches had been broken off a small tree. They hung at odd angles, their leaves already beginning to wilt. I frowned, moving closer to investigate. The breaks didn't look like the work of any animal I knew. They were too high up for a deer and too clean for a bear. It almost looked as if someone had deliberately snapped them off. But who would do that and why? A twig snapped behind me and I whirled around, my heart suddenly racing. But it was just Dave stumbling out of the RV with a murmured, "Good morning," and making a beeline for the coffee pot. I hesitated, then decided not to mention the broken branches. No need to worry Dave over what was probably nothing. Still, as we went about our morning routine, breakfast, cleaning up, planning our day, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We spent the day exploring the area around our campsite. There was a nice hiking trail that followed the creek upstream, winding through the forest and offering beautiful views of the surrounding mountains. Dave was in his element, pointing out various plants and birds, his earlier stress seeming to melt away in the face of nature's beauty. As we hiked, I found myself scanning the trees, looking for, well, I wasn't sure what. More broken branches, signs of large animals. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the uneasy feeling from the morning persisted, sitting in the pit of my stomach like a stone. We returned to the campsite late in the afternoon, tired but happy. Dave insisted on cooking dinner. He'd brought along some steaks he wanted to grill over the campfire. As the smell of cooking meat filled the air, I found myself relaxing. The unease of the morning seemed distant and silly in the face of good food and good company. After dinner, we sat by the fire again, nursing our beers and swapping old stories. The night was peaceful, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle burble of the creek. Then suddenly, a noise broke the silence. It was faint at first, a rustling in the underbrush, barely audible over the fire, but it grew louder, closer. It sounded like something large moving through the trees, just beyond the ring of firelight. Dave broke off mid-sentence, his eyes widening. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my earlier unease rushing back full force. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Probably just a deer or something." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The noise was too loud, too deliberate for a deer. Whatever was out there, it was big. We sat in tense silence, straining our ears. The rustling continued for a few more moments, then abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. "Maybe we should head in for the night," Dave suggested, his voice shaky. I agreed. and we quickly doused the fire and retreated to the safety of the RV. As I locked the door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night I dreamed of dark shapes moving through the trees, of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. I woke several times, sweating and disoriented, only to be lulled back to sleep by Dave's steady breathing and the familiar confines of the RV. When morning came again, I was exhausted. Dave didn't look much better. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he moved with the slow caution of someone nursing a hangover. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He nodded, rubbing his face. "Yeah, had some weird dreams. You?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Same here. Must be something in the air out here." We went about our morning routine, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. We both jumped at small noises, and I caught Dave scanning the tree line more than once, a worried frown on his face. As we were cleaning up after breakfast, Dave suddenly grabbed my arm. "Mike," he said, his voice low and urgent, "look at the RV." I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, on the side of the RV, were long, deep scratches. They ran from near the ground all the way up to the windows, as if something huge had raked its claws down the side of the vehicle. "What the hell?" I muttered, moving closer to inspect the damage. The scratches were deep, gouging through the paint to the metal beneath. Whatever had made them was powerful. "We need to leave," Dave said, his voice shaking. "Now." Part of me wanted to agree, to jump in the RV and drive away as fast as we could, but another part, the part that had faced down unruly teenagers for decades, rebelled at the idea of being scared away from our vacation. "Let's not overreact," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It was probably just a bear attracted by the smell of our dinner last night. We'll be more careful about food storage, and it'll leave us alone." Dave didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. "Okay," he said. "But if anything else happens, we're out of here. Deal?" "Deal," I agreed. We spent the rest of the day close to camp, neither of us willing to venture too far into the woods. We fished in the creek, played cards, and tried to pretend everything was normal. But we both kept glancing at the woods, jumping at every unexpected sound. As night fell, we decided to forego the campfire. Instead, we sat in the RV, playing cards by the light of the battery-powered lantern. Outside, the woods seemed to press closer, the darkness feeling almost alive. We were in the middle of a hand of gin rummy when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from right outside the RV. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural, almost human. Dave's cards fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "Mike," he whispered, his face pale in the lantern light. "What the hell is that?" I shook my head, my mouth too dry to speak. The growl came again, louder this time. Something bumped against the side of the RV, making the whole vehicle rock slightly. We sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The bumping continued, moving around the RV as if whatever it was circling us. Then, abruptly, it stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, from right outside the window, came a sound that chilled me to my very core. It was a laugh, a deep, rumbling laugh that sounded almost but not quite human. Dave and I looked at each other, our faces mirrors of terror. Whatever was out there, we both knew one thing for certain. It wasn't a bear. The laughter faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. Dave and I sat motionless, hardly daring to breathe. The battery-powered lantern cast long shadows across the interior of the RV, turning familiar shapes into looming monsters. "What do we do?" Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to start the RV and drive away as fast as we could. But another part, the part that had faced down unruly students and angry parents over the years, rebelled at the idea of running away from an unseen threat. "We wait," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever it is, it can't get in here. We're safe as long as we stay inside." Dave nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew that the thin walls of the Dave nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew that the thin walls of the RV weren't much protection if whatever was out there really wanted to get in. We sat in tense silence for what felt like hours, straining our ears for any sound of movement outside. Occasionally we'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, sending fresh waves of fear through us. But the laughter didn't come again, nor did the growling or the bumping against the RV. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, we finally allowed ourselves to relax slightly. Dave had dozed off in his chair, his head lolling at an uncomfortable angle. I envied him his ability to sleep, even in these circumstances. I had remained awake all night, my eyes fixed on the door, my hands clenched around a heavy flashlight I had grabbed as a makeshift weapon. When the sun had fully risen, I gently shook Dave awake. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's check outside." Dave blinked awake, confusion giving way to remembrance, and then fear as the events of the night came back to him. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I wasn't sure at all, but I knew we couldn't stay in the RV forever. "We'll be careful," I promised. "Just a quick look around." Slowly, cautiously, we opened the RV door and stepped outside. The morning was beautiful, crisp and clear, with no sign of the terror we had experienced during the night. Birds were singing, the creek was burbling peacefully, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. But as we walked around the RV, we saw evidence that last night hadn't been a dream or a shared hallucination. There were deep impressions in the soft ground around the RV, huge, misshapen footprints that looked almost, but not quite, human. And on the side of the RV, in addition to the scratches we had noticed before, there was now a smear of some dark, foul-smelling substance. Dave leaned in to examine it, then recoiled quickly. "God, what is that?" he gagged. I shook my head, fighting back my own wave of nausea. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. We need to leave, Dave, now." This time there was no argument. We quickly packed up our campsite, our earlier careful organization replaced by a frantic need to get away as quickly as possible. Within an hour we were on the road, the RV bouncing along the dirt track that led back to the main highway. As we drove, Dave and I discussed what to do next. We both agreed that we needed to report what had happened, but we were less certain about who to tell. The police? The Forest Service? Would anyone even believe us? In the end, we decided to stop at the ranger station near the entrance to Shoshone National Forest. The ranger on duty, a weathered-looking man in his 50s named John Hawkins, listened to our story with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. When we finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes flickering between Dave and me as if trying to gauge our sincerity. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You boys aren't the first to come in here with a story like that," he said quietly. Dave and I exchanged surprised glances. "You mean, this has happened before?" I asked. Ranger Hawkins nodded slowly. "We get a few reports every year. Campers hearing strange noises, seeing footprints, that sort of thing. Most folks write it off as bears or mountain lions, but..." He trailed off, his gaze distant. "But what?" Dave pressed. The ranger seemed to shake himself out of his reverie. "But there are stories," he said. "Old stories passed down by the Shoshone people who lived in these parts long before us. They talk about a creature that lives in the deepest parts of the forest. Something that's not quite animal, not quite human." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the laughter we had heard, that terrible, almost human laugh. "What do they call it?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. "The Shoshone have a name for it," Ranger Hawkins said, "but most folks around here just call it the Jaeger." "The Jaeger," Dave repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. What is it supposed to be?" The ranger shrugged. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's a type of Bigfoot. Others think it's something older, something that was here long before humans came to these parts. All the stories agree on one thing, though. It's dangerous, cunning, and it doesn't like people in its territory." We left the ranger station with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of unease. Dave and I agreed to head back to Denver immediately, neither of us feeling up to continuing our camping trip after what we had experienced. The drive back was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about the Jaeger, about those footprints and that terrible laughter. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as nonsense, as the product of overactive imaginations and too many campfire stories. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen, and I knew that whatever was out there in the Shoshone National Forest, it was very, very real. We arrived back in Denver late that night. Dave and I said our goodbyes, promising to keep in touch, but as the days turned into weeks and then months, we spoke less and less. It was as if by not talking about what had happened, we could pretend it had never occurred at all. Life went on. I threw myself into my retirement activities, volunteering, gardening, the occasional substitute teaching gig. But the memory of that night in the woods never fully left me. Sometimes late at night I would wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman laughter ringing in my ears. 5 years passed. I had almost convinced myself that the whole incident had been some sort of shared delusion, a product of stress and an unfamiliar environment. Then, one crisp autumn morning, I received a call that would shatter that comforting illusion forever. It was Dave's wife, Susan. Her voice was thick with tears as she told me the news. Dave had gone missing during a solo camping trip in the Shoshone National Forest. As Susan spoke, describing how Dave had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his trip, how he had become obsessed with researching local legends and folklore, I felt a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I knew with a certainty that defied rational explanation that Dave had gone back to look for the Jaeger, and I knew with equal certainty that I had to go find him. The next day, I loaded up my old RV and set out for Wyoming. As I drove, memories of that night 5 years ago came flooding back. The scratches on the RV, the footprints in the mud, that terrible mocking laughter. But this time, I wasn't going in unprepared. I had spent the night researching everything I could find about the Jaeger and the legends surrounding it. I had packed supplies, weapons, and every piece of camping and survival gear I owned. As I crossed the state line into Wyoming, I glanced at myself in the rearview mirror. The face that looked back at me was older, more lined, but set with a determination I hadn't felt in years. "I'm coming, Dave," I muttered to myself, "and this time we're going to get answers." Little did I know that the answers I sought would be far more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The creature that waited for me in the depths of the Shoshone National Forest was more than just a legend, more than just a monster. It was something ancient, something primal, something that had been waiting a very long time for someone like me to come looking for it. As I drove deeper into Wyoming, the sun setting behind me and the forests looming ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving towards my destiny. Whether that destiny would bring salvation or doom, only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the Jaeger was waiting. And this time, there would be no escape. The familiar landscape of Wyoming rolled by outside my RV window, but this time, the beauty of the rugged terrain was lost on me. My mind was consumed with worry for Dave and apprehension about what lay ahead. I had called Susan before leaving Denver, promising her that I would do everything in my power to find Dave. She had given me what little information she had: the name of the campground where Dave had last been seen, the date he was supposed to return. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. As I neared the turnoff for Shoshone National Forest, I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. The memories of our last trip here were still vivid, despite the years that had passed. I could almost hear that inhuman laughter echoing in my ears. I pulled into the ranger station, hoping to speak with Ranger Hawkins again. But the man behind the desk was younger, probably in his early 30s. His name tag read, Mark Thompson. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked politely as I approached. I explained the situation as best I could, trying to strike a balance between urgency and not sounding like a complete lunatic. To his credit, Ranger Thompson listened attentively, his brow furrowing with concern. "We did have a report of a missing camper," he said when I finished. "A David Whitman. Is that your friend?" I nodded, a mix of relief and dread washing over me. Relief that Dave's disappearance had been noted, dread at the confirmation that he was indeed missing. Ranger Thompson pulled out a map of the forest, spreading it out on the desk between us. "Mr. Whitman's car was found here," he said, pointing to a spot near a campground. "We've had search parties out every day, but so far we haven't found any sign of him." I leaned in, studying the map. The campground was close to where Dave and I had camped 5 years ago. Too close to be a coincidence, I was sure. "I'd like to join the search," I said. Ranger Thompson looked at me doubtfully. "Sir, I appreciate your concern for your friend, but our search and rescue teams are trained professionals. It might be better if you left this to them." I shook my head firmly. "I'm going out there, with or without your blessing. I know these woods, and I know Dave. I might see something your teams would miss." The ranger sighed, recognizing the determination in my voice. "All right," he said reluctantly, "but please be careful. These woods can be dangerous, especially if you're not prepared." If only he knew how dangerous, I thought grimly. I spent the rest of the day preparing for my search. I stocked up on supplies, studied the map Ranger Thompson had given me, and tried to recall everything I could about our previous trip and the legend of the Jaeger. As night fell, I parked my RV at the campground where Dave's car had been found. The place was quiet, most of the other campers having left due to the search activity. I was grateful for the solitude. It would make it easier for me to conduct my own investigation without raising suspicion. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound from the forest outside set my nerves on edge. Was it just the wind in the trees or something more sinister? As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When dawn finally broke, I was already up and ready to go. I packed a day bag with water, food, a first aid kit, and other essentials. After a moment's hesitation, I also included the old revolver I had brought with me. I wasn't sure it would be much use against the Jaeger if the legends were true, but its weight was reassuring nonetheless. I set out just as the sun was cresting the horizon, the forest around me still shrouded in early morning mist. I had a general idea of where I wanted to go, the area where Dave and I had camped 5 years ago. It was a hunch, but it was all I had to go on. As I hiked, I kept my senses alert for any sign of Dave or anything unusual, but the forest seemed peaceful, almost eerily so. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had been walking for several hours when I found the first sign that I was on the right track. There, half hidden by a bush, was a scrap of fabric. I recognized it immediately. It was from the jacket Dave had been wearing in the photo Susan had shown me. My heart pounding, I pushed deeper into the forest. The terrain was becoming rougher, the trees growing closer together. I was pretty sure I had left the marked trails behind some time ago. Then, as I rounded a large boulder, I saw it. The clearing where Dave and I had camped 5 years ago. It looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow. But there was no mistaking it, and there in the center of the clearing was a tent. Dave's tent. I approached cautiously, calling out Dave's name, but there was no response. The clearing was silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. The tent was empty, but it showed signs of a struggle. The fabric was torn in several places, and Dave's sleeping bag was half pulled out of the entrance, as if he had been dragged from the tent. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my hand going to the revolver at my hip. There, at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. For a moment I thought it was Dave, but as my eyes focused, I realized with a jolt of terror that it was something else entirely. It was tall, far taller than any man, its body covered in matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence, and its mouth was stretched in a terrible, mocking grin. The Jaeger. It was real, and it was here. As I stood frozen in shock and fear, the creature threw back its head and laughed, that same chilling laugh I had heard 5 years ago. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and vanished into the forest. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. But eventually I managed to shake off my paralysis. I knew I should leave, should run back to the ranger station and report what I had seen. But Dave was still out there somewhere, and now I knew for certain what had taken him. With shaking hands, I checked my revolver, making sure it was loaded. Then, taking a deep breath to steady myself, I plunged into the forest after the Jaeger. I was no longer just searching for my friend. I was hunting a monster, and I had a terrible feeling that it was hunting me too. The forest seemed to close in around me as I moved deeper into its depths, following the path the Jaeger had taken. The trees here were old, their gnarled branches reaching out like grasping fingers. blocking out much of the sunlight. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the musty scent of decaying leaves and something else, something rank and animal. I tried to move as quietly as possible, but every snapping twig under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the eerie silence. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, my hand never straying far from the revolver at my hip. The weight of the gun was reassuring, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind wondered if it would be any use against a creature like the Jaeger. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I pushed on. The forest all looked the same. Endless trees, patches of undergrowth, the occasional boulder or fallen log. I began to fear that I was walking in circles, that I would never find my way out again. Then, just as despair was beginning to set in, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, impaled on a broken branch at about eye level, was a scrap of cloth. As I moved closer, my heart sinking, I recognized it as a piece of Dave's shirt. It was stained dark with what could only be blood. Fighting back a wave of nausea, I forced myself to examine the area more closely. There were other signs of disturbance. Broken branches, scuff marks in the dirt, more drops of blood. It looked like something large had been dragged through here. With a grim determination, I continued to follow the trail. The signs of passage became more pronounced. Deep gouges in the tree trunks, tufts of coarse hair caught on thorny bushes, and an increasingly strong musky odor that made my nose wrinkle in disgust. As I pressed on, the forest began to change. The trees grew more twisted and misshapen, their bark blackened as if by some ancient fire. The ground beneath my feet became soggy and treacherous, each step accompanied by a sickening squelch. I realized I was entering a swampy area, one that wasn't marked on any of the maps I had studied. The light was fading fast now, the gloom of twilight settling over the forest like a shroud. I knew I should turn back, that continuing on in the growing darkness was madness. But the thought of Dave, alone and at the mercy of that creature, spurred me onward. It was then that I heard it, a low, keening wail that echoed through the trees. It was a sound of pain, of desperation, and it was unmistakably human. "Dave!" I shouted, my voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. "Dave, where are you?" The wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, from somewhere ahead of me, I heard a weak voice call out, "Mike, is that you? Oh God, Mike, help me!" It was Dave. He was alive. I surged forward, my fatigue forgotten in a rush of adrenaline. I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and tore at my clothes. All that mattered was reaching Dave. I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt, my eyes struggling to make sense of what I was seeing in the dim light. In the center of the clearing was a crude structure, a sort of nest made from broken branches and what looked horribly like human bones. And there, half buried in the debris, was Dave. He looked terrible. His clothes were in tatters, his body covered in cuts and bruises. One of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. But he was alive, and as he saw me, his eyes lit up with a desperate hope. "Mike," he gasped, "you came. You actually came." I rushed to his side, my hand shaking as I began to pull away the branches covering him. "Of course I came," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I couldn't leave you out here. Come on, we need to get you out of here before—" A low, rumbling growl cut me off mid-sentence. I froze, then slowly turned around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the Jaeger. In the fading light, it seemed even more monstrous than before. Its massive body was covered in matted fur, caked with mud, and what I prayed wasn't blood. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a protruding snout and yellowed, pointed teeth. But its eyes were the worst part. They glowed with an eerie intelligence, filled with a malevolence that was all too human. For a long moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground, the Jaeger charged. I didn't think, I just reacted. I drew my revolver and fired, the sound of the shots deafening in the enclosed space of the clearing. The Jaeger staggered, dark blood blossoming on its chest, but it didn't go down. If anything, the wounds only seemed to enrage it further. With a speed that belied its size, the creature closed the distance between us. I managed to squeeze off one more shot before it was upon me, its massive paw swatting the gun from my hand as if it were a toy. The impact sent me sprawling, and I tasted blood as my head struck the ground. Through a haze of pain, I saw the Jaeger looming over me, its foul breath hot on my face as it prepared to deliver the killing blow. In that moment, facing what I was sure was my death, a strange calm settled over me. I thought of my life, of the people I loved, of Dave lying injured just a few feet away, and I knew I couldn't give up. With a yell that surprised even me, I surged upward, driving my fist into the Jaeger's throat. It was like punching a brick wall, but the creature reared back, momentarily stunned. It was all the opening I needed. I scrambled to my feet and lunged for my fallen revolver. My fingers closed around the grip just as the Jaeger recovered and charged again. I rolled onto my back, brought the gun up, and emptied the remaining chambers into the creature's face. The Jaeger's roar of rage turned into a shriek of pain. It thrashed wildly, its massive body convulsing as it fought against the bullets tearing through its skull. Then, with a final earth-shaking bellow, it collapsed. For several long moments I lay there, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The clearing was silent save for my ragged breathing and Dave's quiet whimpers of pain. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. The Jaeger lay motionless, dark blood pooling beneath its massive head. I approached cautiously, the gun still trained on its body, but there was no need. The creature was dead. I turned back to Dave, my hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. "It's over," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "It's really over." The next few hours passed in a blur. Somehow I managed to get Dave free from the nest and support him as we made our slow, painful way back through the forest. It was full dark by the time we reached the edge of the woods, but there were lights ahead, flashlights, bobbing in the darkness. The search party found us just as Dave's strength gave out. I remember collapsing to my knees, still holding on to my friend, as voices shouted and hands reached out to help us. The aftermath was a whirlwind of hospitals, police interviews, and media attention. Dave's story of abduction by an unknown creature made headlines, but without any concrete evidence. The Jaeger's body had vanished by the time a search team made it back to the clearing. It was eventually written off as the delusions of a man who had suffered a traumatic experience. As for me, I told a carefully edited version of events, leaving out any mention of the Jaeger. Who would have believed me anyway? In time, the furor died down, and life began to return to normal. But I knew the truth. I had seen the Jaeger with my own eyes, had felt its hot breath on my face, had watched it die. And sometimes late at night I find myself wondering, was it really the only one of its kind? Or are there more creatures out there, hiding in the dark places of the world, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble into their domain? I don't go camping anymore. The call of the wild has lost its appeal for me. But every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving where no shadow should be. A flash of glowing eyes in the darkness. And I'll remember that night in the Shoshone National Forest and the monster I faced there. The Jaeger may be gone, but its memory lives on. And in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, who knows what other secrets are waiting to be discovered. As I sit here, an old man now, recounting this story, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. The world is a mysterious place, full of wonders and terrors beyond our understanding. And sometimes, just sometimes, those terrors have teeth and claws, and a laugh that echoes through the night, calling to something primitive and fearful, deep within us all. So the next time you're in the woods, and you hear a twig snap behind you, or see a shadow move in the corner of your eye, remember my story. Remember the Jaeger. And whatever you do, don't look back, because you never know what might be gaining on you in the darkness. My name is David Rodriguez, and I am 78 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 1992 when I was 46. I've kept this story to myself for over 3 decades, but now as I feel the weight of my years pressing down on me, I think it's time to share it. Maybe someone out there can make sense of what happened to me. Or maybe it'll serve as a warning to those who think they can venture into the wild places of this world without consequence. I've never been much of a storyteller, but I'll do my best to lay it out straight. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those eyes haunting me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. It was early June 1992. I'd finally saved up enough to buy a used RV, a 1985 Winnebago Chieftain. She wasn't much to look at, with her faded paint and a few dents here and there. But to me, she was freedom on wheels. I'd been working as a mechanic in Little Rock for the better part of 2 decades, and the idea of hitting the open road had been calling to me for years. I remember the day I decided to take her out for her first real spin. The air was thick with humidity, typical for Arkansas that time of year. The cicadas were singing their endless summer song, and the sun was beating down mercilessly. I'd heard about a quiet spot in the Ouachita National Forest from a buddy of mine, Joe Hawkins. Joe was an avid hunter and knew those woods like the back of his hand. Dave, he'd said to me over beers one night, "If you want real peace and quiet, head out to Ouachita. There's a spot near Lake Ouachita off the beaten path. You won't find it on any map, but it's God's country out there." He'd given me rough directions, more of a general area than a specific location, but that was fine by me. I was looking for an adventure, a chance to unwind and disconnect from the world. Little did I know what kind of adventure I was in for. I packed up the RV with enough supplies for a week: canned goods, fishing gear, a couple of books I'd been meaning to read, and of course a cooler full of beer. I said goodbye to my neighbor, old Mrs. Thompson, and told her I'd be back in a week or so. She waved from her porch, her face etched with concern. "You be careful out there, David," she called. "Those woods can be dangerous for a city boy like you." I laughed it off at the time. Mrs. Thompson was always worrying about something or other. But looking back, I wonder if she knew something I didn't. The drive out of Little Rock was uneventful. I headed west on I-30, then south on US 70. The further I got from the city, the more relaxed I felt. The radio crackled with static, the only station I could pick up playing country songs I didn't recognize. But that was fine by me. The hum of the road and the occasional twang from the speakers were all the company I needed. As I turned onto the smaller roads leading into the Ouachita National Forest, the world seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their canopies blocking out much of the sky. The air felt different too, cooler, damper, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I rolled down the windows, letting the forest air fill the RV. It was late afternoon by the time I started looking for a place to camp. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The winding roads had become little more than dirt tracks, and I was starting to worry I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. But then, just as I was considering turning back, I saw it. A small clearing by a lake, hidden from the main road by a thick stand of trees. I carefully maneuvered the RV into the clearing, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. As I stepped out, I was struck by the silence. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. The lake was small but beautiful, its surface like a mirror reflecting the darkening sky. "Perfect," I muttered to myself, a smile spreading across my face. This was exactly what I'd been looking for. Setting up camp was simple enough. I leveled out the RV, hooked up the battery to power the essentials, and set up a folding chair by the lake. As the last light of day faded, I cracked open a beer and sat back, feeling the tension of the week melt away. The quiet was almost unsettling at first, so different from the constant background noise of the city. But as I sat there watching the stars come out one by one, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I figured I'd stay a couple of days, do some fishing, maybe read a book or two. It was supposed to be a break from the grind, a chance to recharge and come back to civilization refreshed. If only I'd known what was waiting for me in those woods. If only I'd listened to that nagging voice in the back of my mind that said something wasn't quite right. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. And I was about to learn that sometimes the price of seeking solitude can be higher than you ever imagined. As the evening wore on, I decided to fire up the small portable grill I'd brought along. There's something primal about cooking over an open flame, especially out in the wilderness. I had some burgers in the cooler, nothing fancy, just some ground beef I'd shaped into patties before leaving home. The sizzle of the meat on the grill and the smell of it cooking should have been appetizing, but that's when I noticed something odd. There was a strange smell in the air, something that seemed out of place in the fresh forest atmosphere. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the scent of the cooking meat. But as I stood there, spatula in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The smell was wrong. It reminded me of sulfur, that rotten egg smell, but mixed with something else, something worse, like rotting meat, but not quite. I wrinkled my nose, looking around the clearing. The lake was calm, reflecting the last remnants of twilight. The trees stood silent sentinels at the edge of the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place but that smell. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Maybe it was just some stagnant water nearby, or some decaying vegetation. That had to be it. But even as I tried to rationalize it, a part of me knew better. In all my years of camping and hunting, I'd never smelled anything quite like this. It was alien, out of place, and it set my teeth on edge. I finished cooking the burgers, but found my appetite had waned. I managed to eat one, washing it down with another beer, but the second patty went uneaten. As I cleaned up, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the encroaching darkness and that persistent, unsettling smell. Night fell quickly, as it often does in the forest. The clearing was plunged into an inky blackness that seemed to swallow up the beam of my flashlight. The stars, at least, were brilliant. Without the light pollution of the city, the Milky Way stretched across the sky in a dazzling display. Under different circumstances, I would have sat out for hours, just stargazing. But that night, I felt an urge to be inside, behind locked doors. I secured everything outside, making sure the grill was completely out and storing the cooler in the RV's small exterior compartment. As I did my final check, I noticed the smell had faded. Maybe I had imagined it after all. Maybe it was just my city senses adjusting to the unfamiliar forest scents. Inside the RV, things felt more normal. The space was cozy, if a bit cramped. I had a small table that doubled as a workspace, a surprisingly comfortable bed, and a kitchenette that was more functional than fancy. I'd brought along a few books, some Louis L'Amour westerns and a Stephen King novel I'd been meaning to get around to. I settled in with one of the L'Amour books, reading by the dim light of a battery-powered lantern. But I couldn't focus on the words. My mind kept drifting back to that smell, to the feeling of being watched. I found myself straining to hear any sound from outside, but there was nothing except the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eventually, fatigue began to set in. The drive, the fresh air, and the beers had taken their toll. I marked my place in the book and got ready for bed. As I lay there in the darkness, I could hear the wind picking up, whistling through the trees. It was a lonely sound, reminding me of just how isolated I was out here. My last conscious thought before drifting off was a note to myself to check the RV's propane lines in the morning. Maybe that was the source of the sulfur smell. It was a comforting thought, a rational explanation that allowed me to finally relax and let sleep take me. If only I'd stayed awake a little longer. If only I'd been more alert. Maybe I would have heard it coming. Maybe I would have had a chance to leave before things went so terribly wrong. But I slept, unaware that something out there in the darkness had taken notice of me, and it was getting closer. I'm not sure how long I slept, but I woke with a start, my heart pounding. For a moment I was disoriented, forgetting where I was. The inside of the RV was pitch black and the silence was absolute. Then I heard it, the sound that must have woken me. It was a scratching noise coming from outside. At first I thought it might be a branch scraping against the side of the RV, but as I listened I realized it was too regular, too deliberate. It sounded like nails on metal, a slow, methodical scratching that sent shivers down my spine. My first rational thought was raccoons. They can be pretty bold, and I wouldn't have been surprised to find them trying to get into the cooler. But even as I had the thought, I knew it wasn't right. The sound was too loud, too powerful to be made by something as small as a raccoon. I lay there in the darkness, barely breathing, just listening. The scratching continued, moving slowly along the side of the RV. Whatever was making the noise was big. My mind, still foggy with sleep, conjured images of bears, mountain lions, impossible monsters with claws like knives. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just lie there and wait for whatever it was to find its way inside. Moving as quietly as I could, I reached for the flashlight I'd left on the small bedside table. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The scratching stopped abruptly. Had it heard me move? I held my breath, straining my ears. The silence stretched on, broken only by the pounding of my heart, so loud I was sure it must be audible outside. Then I heard something else, a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and it filled me with a primal, instinctive fear. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I knew I had to look. I had to see what was out there. With a trembling hand, I reached for the curtain covering the small window near my bed. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers on the fabric. Did I really want to see what was making those sounds? What if it saw me? The decision was made for me when something heavy slammed against the side of the RV, rocking it on its wheels. I let out an involuntary yelp, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. In one motion, I yanked back the curtain and clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing. For a split second, I saw something, a shape, dark and massive, moving with impossible speed at the edge of the light. Then it was gone, vanishing into the tree line so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. I sat there, flashlight trained on the spot where I'd seen the shape, for what felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It had been big, that much I was sure of. Bigger than a bear and shaped all wrong, but beyond that I couldn't say. It had moved so fast, been there and gone in the blink of an eye. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I became aware of other things. The smell was back, stronger than ever. That sulfurous, rotting odor seemed to permeate everything. And there was something else, a sense of wrongness in the air, as if reality itself had been warped by whatever had visited in the night. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up, flashlight in one hand and my hunting knife in the other, watching the windows and listening for any sound of the thing's return. But there was nothing. Just the quiet of the forest and that lingering, awful smell. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Whatever had been out there seemed to have gone. But I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be staying another night in this clearing. As soon as it was fully light, I was going to pack up and move on. Maybe find a campground with other people around. Or maybe just head back to civilization altogether. Little did I know, my encounter in the night was just the beginning. The true terror was yet to come. The sun rose slowly, as if it too was hesitant to shed light on whatever had transpired during the night. As soon as it was bright enough to see clearly, I cautiously stepped out of the RV, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. The morning was crisp and cool, a light mist hanging over the lake. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. But all I could focus on were the marks on the side of the RV. They were unmistakable, 4 long, parallel gouges running along the metal siding. They started about halfway up and ran almost to the ground. Whatever had made them had some serious claws. I ran my fingers along the marks, feeling the depth of them. These weren't just surface scratches. The metal was deeply scored. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized how close the thing had been. Only a thin metal wall had separated me from whatever had made these marks, and judging by the height of the scratches, it had been big, much bigger than I'd initially thought. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a bear. A big one, sure, but still just a bear. They were known to roam these parts after all. But even as I had the thought, I knew it wasn't true. Bears didn't move the way that thing had moved. They didn't disappear into the night like a shadow. And they certainly didn't leave behind that god-awful smell, which I noticed was still lingering in the air. I did a quick circuit of the clearing, looking for tracks or any other signs of what had visited in the night. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and pine needles, not great for leaving prints. But near the edge of the clearing, where the ground was a bit softer, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. But not like any animal prints I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot. And they weren't shaped like a bear's paw or any other creature I could think of. They were almost human-like, but elongated and with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I stared at the prints, trying to make sense of them. What kind of creature could have left these? My mind flashed back to stories I'd heard as a kid, tales of Bigfoot and other mysterious beasts said to roam the wilderness. But this seemed like something else entirely. As I stood there lost in thought, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing there, just the trees, their branches moving slightly in the morning breeze. That was enough for me. Whatever was out here, whatever had visited in the night, I wanted no part of it. I practically ran back to the RV, my earlier bravado completely forgotten. I had to get out of here. I packed up as quickly as I could, throwing my gear haphazardly into the RV. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. My only thought was putting as much distance between myself and this clearing as possible. As I was about to start the engine, I took one last look around. The forest seemed different now, darker somehow, despite the morning sunlight. I could have sworn I saw movement in the tree line, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. I gunned the engine and pulled out of the clearing, tires spinning on the loose dirt. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing after the RV, but the road behind me remained empty. I drove nonstop for several hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I didn't have a clear destination in mind. I just knew I needed to put distance between myself and whatever I'd encountered in that clearing. The forest gradually thinned out, giving way to more open country. When I finally saw signs for a small town called Mina, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The normality of the place, the hum of the refrigerators, the ding of the bell as customers came and went, was almost shocking after the otherworldly experience of the night before. I went inside to pay for gas and grab a much-needed coffee. The attendant, an older guy with a grizzled beard and a name tag that read Earl, took one look at my pale face and wild eyes and asked if I was all right. I hesitated for a moment. How could I possibly explain what had happened? But something in Earl's expression, a mixture of concern and knowing, made me open up. I told him about the footprints, the smell, the eyes I'd seen in the darkness. As I spoke, Earl's expression grew more serious. When I finished, he nodded slowly, as if he'd heard it all before. "Sounds like you met the Kushtaka," he said, his voice low and serious. "The what?" I asked, confused. "Kushtaka," Earl repeated. "Old folks around here have stories about it. They say it's a shapeshifter, a creature that can take on human form but isn't human at all. They're drawn to the scent of fear and loneliness." I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just a local legend. But something about Earl's tone, the way his eyes looked right through me, made me uneasy. "Listen, son," Earl said, leaning in close. "Whatever you do, don't go back into those woods alone. The Kushtaka, they say it likes to lure people deeper into the forest. And those that follow, well, they don't come back." I thanked Earl for the warning, paid for my gas, and hurried back to the RV. As I pulled out of the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd had a narrow escape. But at least I was out of those woods now. I decided to head straight back to Little Rock, back to the safety of civilization. The drive back to Little Rock was uneventful, but I couldn't relax. Every shadow on the road seemed to move. Every dark patch of forest along the highway seemed to hide watching eyes. I kept the radio on loud, tuned to a talk station, just to have some human voices to keep me company. It was late afternoon by the time I pulled into my driveway. Mrs. Thompson was out on her porch again, and she waved as I parked the RV. I waved back, managing a weak smile. How could I explain that her warning had been more accurate than either of us could have imagined? That night, safe in my own bed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd eaten some bad food or the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those inhuman eyes staring back at me from the darkness. It's been over 3 decades since that night in the Ouachita National Forest, but I've never forgotten it. I've never gone back to those woods, and I've never camped alone again. The RV sat in my driveway for years, the scratches on its side a constant reminder of what I'd encountered. I sold it eventually, but I never told the buyer about its history. Some nights when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still smell that sickly, sulfurous odor. In my dreams, I'm back in that clearing, and something is circling the RV, scratching, trying to get in. I don't know what I saw out there. Maybe it was the kushtaka that Earl talked about, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely go. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I was lucky to escape. Whatever was out there, it let me go. Or maybe it's just biding its time, waiting for me to let my guard down. So if you're ever in the Ouachita National Forest and you find a secluded spot that seems too perfect, think twice before you set up camp. And if you smell something strange on the night air, something like sulfur and rotting meat, don't ignore it like I did. Pack up and leave. Drive until you hit civilization. And whatever you do, don't look back. Because something is out there in those woods, and it's hungry. August 15th, 2003. The sun was just beginning to dip below the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains as I maneuvered my weathered RV along the winding Montana backroads. At 70 years old, I found a certain comfort in the familiar rumble of the engine and the creak of the suspension as we climbed higher into the wilderness. My name is Joseph Wilson, and this is the story of a camping trip that would change my life forever. The idea for this solo expedition had been brewing in my mind for weeks. Working as an insurance claims adjuster in Missoula wasn't exactly the most thrilling profession for a man my age. Don't get me wrong, I was grateful for the stability it provided, but there was always a part of me that yearned for adventure. That's why, every few months, I'd pack up my trusty RV and head out into the wilderness, seeking solitude and a break from the monotony of everyday life. This particular trip had been meticulously planned. I had enough supplies to last a week: canned goods, bottled water, a few choice books, and my trusty fishing rod. The Bitterroot Mountains had always held a special allure for me. Their rugged beauty and vast expanses of untamed wilderness spoke to something primal in my soul. As I drove deeper into the forest, the last vestiges of civilization faded away. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to little more than a dirt track. The thick pines pressed in on either side, their branches scraping against the sides of the RV like gnarled fingers. I couldn't help but feel a small thrill of excitement mixed with a touch of apprehension. Out here, I was truly on my own. After about an hour of careful navigation, I finally spotted the perfect clearing. It was a small opening in the dense forest, maybe 50 feet across, with a babbling stream cutting through one corner. The ground was relatively flat, covered in a soft carpet of pine needles and moss. It was exactly what I had been hoping to find. With practiced ease, I backed the RV into position, making sure to leave enough room for my tent. Even though I had the comfort of the RV, there was something about sleeping under canvas that made me feel more connected to nature. Plus, at my age, it was good to remind myself that I could still rough it when I wanted to. As I stepped out of the RV, the crisp mountain air filled my lungs. The scent of pine and earth was intoxicating. I took a moment to stretch, my old bones creaking almost as much as the RV had on the drive up. The sun had fully set now, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. I set about making camp with the efficiency of long practice. First, I cleared a space for my fire pit, carefully arranging stones in a circle. Then I gathered some dry wood from the edge of the clearing. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a curious deer, or maybe even a bear. But each time there was nothing but the silent, dark forest. With the fire crackling merrily, I turned my attention to setting up the tent. It was an old two-person affair, faded green canvas that had seen better days but still kept out the rain and wind. As I hammered in the last tent peg, a cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sound that made me pause. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but for a moment, I could have sworn I heard singing or maybe chanting. I straightened up, straining my ears, but the sound, if it had been there at all, was gone. "Getting jumpy in your old age, Joe," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. It was probably just the wind playing tricks on me, or maybe some far-off campers enjoying their own fire. With camp set up, I settled into my folding chair by the fire, a cold beer in one hand and my dog-eared copy of Moby Dick in the other. As the flames danced and the stars wheeled overhead, I felt the tension of the city beginning to melt away. This was what I had come for: peace, solitude, and the simple pleasure of being alone with my thoughts. As I read, occasionally sipping my beer, I found my mind wandering. I thought about my life back in Missoula, my small apartment, the office where I spent my days poring over accident reports and medical bills. It wasn't a bad life, but sitting here in the wilderness, I couldn't help but wonder if I had missed out on something. Maybe I should have taken more risks, sought out more adventures when I was younger. I was jolted from my reverie by a sudden crack from the forest. My head snapped up, eyes straining to penetrate the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. Probably just a deer, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now felt oppressive, as if it were closing in around me. Deciding it was time to turn in, I doused the fire and retreated to my tent. As I zipped up the entrance, I could have sworn I heard that faint chanting again, carried on the night breeze. But by the time I had my ear pressed against the canvas, straining to listen, it was gone. Sleep came fitfully that night. My dreams were a confused jumble of shadowy figures moving through the trees and eerie, discordant music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. More than once I jerked awake, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something moving just outside the tent, but each time there was nothing but the quiet whisper of wind through the pines. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the canvas, I gave up on sleep entirely. I emerged from the tent, stretching my stiff muscles and breathing in the cool morning air. The clearing looked exactly as I had left it the night before, no sign of any nocturnal visitors. As I set about rekindling the fire and brewing a pot of coffee, I tried to shake off the unease that had plagued me through the night. "You're out here to relax, old man," I told myself sternly. "Stop jumping at shadows." Little did I know as I sipped my coffee and watched the sun climb over the mountains that this was only the beginning. The true test of my courage and my sanity was yet to come. The next few days passed without incident, and I slowly began to relax into the rhythm of camping life. I spent my mornings exploring the area around my campsite, taking long hikes through the dense forest. The Bitterroot Mountains were truly breathtaking, with their towering pines, crystal-clear streams, and occasional meadows bursting with wildflowers. On the third day of my trip, I decided to venture a bit further from camp. I packed a small day pack with water, some trail mix, and a first aid kit. At my age, it paid to be prepared. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool and crisp with a gentle breeze that kept the mosquitoes at bay. As I made my way along a faint game trail, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not many 70-year-olds would be out here, miles from civilization, trekking through the wilderness. It was a reminder that I still had some adventure left in me, despite the creaks in my joints and the gray in my hair. About 2 hours into my hike, I came across a small clearing. It was there that I had my first truly strange encounter of the trip. As I stepped out of the trees, I nearly collided with two men coming from the opposite direction. They were both in their mid-30s, wearing expensive-looking hiking gear that seemed barely used. "Oh, hello there," I said, recovering from my surprise. "Didn't expect to run into anyone else out here." The two men exchanged a glance before the taller of the two spoke. "Yeah, same here. We're, just out for a short trip, from Billings." Something about their manner struck me as odd. They seemed tense, almost nervous, their eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out at them from the undergrowth. "Everything all right?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. "You boys look a bit spooked." The shorter man forced a laugh. "Nah, we're good. Just, keeping an eye out for bears and such." We chatted for a few more minutes, exchanging pleasantries and trail information. They introduced themselves as Mike and Dave, but didn't offer last names. As we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were holding something back. Their responses were clipped, and they kept glancing at each other as if silently communicating. "Well, you two take care now," I said finally, deciding it was best to move on. "The mountains can be unpredictable. Stay safe out there." As I turned to continue on my way, I heard Mike mutter something to Dave. I only caught a few words, "shouldn't be here," and "have to warn," before they were out of earshot. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time since starting my trip, I felt truly uneasy. The rest of my hike was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the memory of that strange encounter. What had those men been so nervous about? And what did they think they needed to warn someone about? As I made my way back to camp, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, suddenly aware of how isolated I was out here. That night, as I sat by my campfire nursing a cup of instant coffee, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The forest seemed different somehow, the familiar sounds of the wilderness taking on a sinister quality. The crack of a branch in the darkness made me jump, spilling hot coffee on my hand. As I sucked at the minor burn, I heard it again, that faint, eerie chanting I had dismissed on my first night. This time it was clearer, closer. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the stream. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, straining my ears to catch the sound. The chanting grew louder, more distinct. It was like nothing I had ever heard before, not quite language, but not random noise either. It had a rhythm to it, a pattern that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. And underneath it all was a sense of age, of something ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to stay put, to ignore the sound and go to bed. But something stronger was pulling me towards the stream, a curiosity that overrode my fear. As I approached the water, the chanting abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was almost painful in its intensity. I played my flashlight beam across the surface of the stream, half expecting to see what? Cultists performing some arcane ritual? A group of campers playing an elaborate prank? What I saw instead nearly stopped my heart. There, caught in an eddy near the bank, was a burlap sack. It was old and rotting, barely held together by fraying threads. As my flashlight beam fell on it, I saw something poking out of a tear in the fabric, something white and curved. With trembling hands, I reached out and grabbed the sack, pulling it from the water. It was heavier than I expected, and as I laid it on the bank, a horrible smell assaulted my nostrils, the unmistakable stench of decay. I knew I should leave it alone. I knew I should go back to my camp, pack up and get the hell out of these mountains. But that same morbid curiosity that had drawn me to the stream now compelled me to open the sack. As I pulled apart the rotting burlap, my worst fears were confirmed. Inside were bones, human bones. A skull grinned up at me, its empty eye sockets seeming to accuse me of disturbing its rest. There were other bones too, ribs, vertebrae, what looked like part of a pelvis, all old, all stained dark with time and the water of the stream. I scrambled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was wrong. This was all wrong. People didn't just find human remains on a camping trip. This kind of thing happened in movies, in books, not in real life. Not to insurance adjusters from Missoula on a quiet camping trip. As I stood there, my mind reeling, trying to process what I had just seen, I became aware of a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam shaking wildly as my hand trembled. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form indistinct in the darkness. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw the flash of inhuman eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest as if it had never been there at all. I ran faster than I had in years, my old joints protesting as I sprinted back to my campsite. I burst into my RV, slamming and locking the door behind me. As I huddled there in the dark, trying to catch my breath, I realized two things. First, I was no longer alone in these mountains. Something was out there, something that defied rational explanation. And second, I was in way over my head. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing. I kept replaying the events of the evening in my mind, the chanting, the bones, that impossible figure at the edge of the trees. By the time dawn broke, I had convinced myself that I needed to leave, to get back to civilization and report what I had found. But as the sun rose and bathed the clearing in warm golden light, my fear began to fade. In the harsh light of day, the events of the previous night seemed, if not less real, then at least less immediate. I found myself rationalizing, trying to find logical explanations for what I had experienced. The bones could have been old, very old. Perhaps they were Native American remains washed down from some long-forgotten burial site. The chanting could have been the wind or distant campers, or even just my imagination playing tricks on me. And the figure, well, I was tired, scared, and it was dark. It could have been a bear standing on its hind legs, or just a trick of the shadows. As I sat outside the RV nursing a strong cup of coffee and watching the morning mist rise from the stream, I made a decision. I would stay, at least for now, but I would be more careful. No more wandering around in the dark, no more following strange sounds. I was here to relax and enjoy nature, and that's exactly what I was going to do. With that resolution made, I set about preparing for a day hike. I packed more supplies than usual, extra water, a first aid kit, an emergency blanket, and even a small can of bear spray I had brought along just in case. Better safe than sorry, especially after last night's scare. I set off in a different direction from yesterday's hike, hoping to cover new ground and perhaps put some distance between myself and the site of last night's disturbing discovery. The day was beautiful, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. As I walked, I found my spirits lifting. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals going about their business. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, this same forest had seemed so menacing. After a couple of hours of steady hiking, I came across something unexpected. A small cabin nestled in a tiny clearing. It was old. That much was clear from the weathered wood and sagging roof. Vines and moss covered much of the structure, as if the forest was slowly reclaiming it. Curiosity piqued, I approached cautiously. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and the windows were long since broken, leaving dark, empty sockets in the walls. It looked as if no one had been here in years, maybe decades. "Hello?" I called out, more out of habit than any real expectation of a response. As expected, only silence answered me. I knew I should probably leave well enough alone. After all, hadn't I just resolved to be more careful? But the mystery of this abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere was too intriguing to ignore. With a deep breath, I stepped through the doorway. The interior of the cabin was a mess, just as I had expected. A thick layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by the small tracks of animals that had made this place their home. Old furniture lay scattered about, a broken table, a chair with only 3 legs, a rusted iron stove in one corner. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay and abandonment. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something odd about the walls. They were covered in deep, jagged scratches, as if something with enormous claws had tried to tear its way out. Or perhaps a chilling thought occurred to me, tear its way in. I approached one of the walls, running my fingers lightly over the gouges. They were deep, much deeper than anything a bear or mountain lion could have made, and there was a pattern to them, almost like... A sudden noise from outside made me jump. I spun around, heart pounding, half expecting to see that tall, shadowy figure from the night before looming in the doorway. But there was nothing there, just the gentle sway of trees in the breeze. Taking a deep breath to calm myself, I decided it was time to leave. This place was giving me the creeps, and I'd seen enough. As I turned to go, something caught my eye. There, in the far corner of the cabin, partially hidden by the collapsed remains of what might have been a bed, was a book. Against my better judgment, I crossed the room and picked it up. It was old, the leather cover cracked and faded. There was no title, just a strange symbol embossed on the front, a twisted tree with what looked like faces peering out from its bark. I opened it carefully, afraid the brittle pages might crumble in my hands. It was handwritten, the ink faded but still legible. As I skimmed the first page, my blood ran cold. It was a journal dated 1932, and the first entry read, August 15th, 1932. The chanting has started again. It's closer this time. I fear the guardian has found me. God help me, I should never have come to these cursed mountains. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of joke. a prop left here by pranksters or maybe for a movie shoot. But deep down I knew this was real, and I was in way over my head. I shoved the book into my backpack and practically ran from the cabin. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt oppressive, every shadow potentially hiding unspeakable horrors. I made it back to my campsite in record time, my lungs burning and legs aching from the exertion. As I burst into the clearing, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, right in the middle of my campsite, was a symbol drawn in the dirt, the same twisted tree from the cover of the book. I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear into the RV, not bothering to pack properly. As the engine roared to life, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. That impossibly tall figure was there again, watching me. This time I was sure I wasn't imagining things. I floored the accelerator, the RV bouncing wildly as I sped down the rough forest road. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. As the miles between me and those mountains grew, I began to calm down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Whatever was out there, whatever that guardian was, it had noticed me. And something told me it wasn't done with me yet. I drove for hours, putting as much distance as I could between myself and the Bitterroot Mountains. It wasn't until I saw the familiar skyline of Missoula that I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Home, safety, normalcy. But as I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, I realized that nothing would ever be truly normal again. The events of the past few days had shaken me to my core, challenging everything I thought I knew about the world. I spent the next week in a daze, going through the motions at work but unable to focus on anything but what I had experienced. The chanting, the bones, the cabin, the journal, it all swirled in my mind, a puzzle I couldn't solve but couldn't ignore. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself. Instead, I threw myself into research, spending my evenings hunched over my computer, searching for any information I could find about the Bitterroot Mountains and their legends. Most of what I found was typical tourist information, hiking trails, camping spots, local flora and fauna. But buried deep in forum posts and obscure local history websites, I began to find hints, whispers of something ancient in those mountains, stories of hikers gone missing, of strange sounds in the night, of shadowy figures glimpsed between the trees. One name kept coming up, always in hushed tones, always with a sense of fear and reverence. Nasher, the guardian of the forest, an ancient spirit, some said, a protector of the land, others claimed, a vengeful entity that punished those who disrespected the mountains. The more I read, the more certain I became that this Nasher was what I had encountered. But why me? I had always respected nature, had always been careful to leave no trace when I camped. What had I done to draw its attention? As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a pull, a need to go back to find answers. But fear kept me rooted in Missoula, jumping at shadows and starting awake at night, sure I could hear that eerie chanting in the distance. It was nearly a month after my return when I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Bill Turner, the sheriff from the small town nearest to where I had been camping. "Mr. Wilson?" His gruff voice came through the line. "This is Sheriff Turner. We need to talk about what you saw in the mountains." My heart raced. I don't know what you mean," I stammered, afraid of sounding crazy if I told the truth. "Don't play dumb with me, son," he growled. "2 hikers went missing in those mountains the day after you left. Men matching the description of those fellas you said you ran into. Now, are you going to tell me what really happened up there, or do I need to come to Missoula and ask you in person?" I felt the blood drain from my face. Those 2 men from Billings, Mike and Dave, they were missing, or worse. "I'll come to you," I heard myself saying. "I'll tell you everything I know." As I hung up the phone, I realized that my quiet life as an insurance adjuster was over. Whatever was happening in those mountains, I was a part of it now. And I had a feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger, much darker story. With shaking hands, I began to pack a bag. I was going back to the Bitterroot Mountains, back to face whatever waited for me there, because now I knew running away wasn't an option. The guardian had marked me, and one way or another, I had to see this through to the end. As I zipped up my duffel bag, my eyes fell on the old leather-bound journal I had taken from the cabin. I hadn't been able to bring myself to read more of it since that day. But now I needed every scrap of information I could get. With a deep breath, I opened the book and began to read. As the sun set outside my window, casting long shadows across my living room, I delved deeper into the mystery of the Bitterroot Guardian. Little did I know this was only the beginning of a journey that would change not just my life, but my understanding of the world itself. The drive back to the small town near the Bitterroot Mountains was tense. Every mile brought back memories of my hasty retreat, of the terror I had felt. But it also brought a strange sense of anticipation. I was going back, yes, but this time I wasn't alone. This time I had a purpose. Sheriff Bill Turner was waiting for me when I pulled into the parking lot of the local diner. He was a bear of a man, his craggy face weathered by years in the sun, his eyes sharp and assessing as I approached. "Mr. Wilson," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, calloused. "Glad you could make it. Let's talk inside." Over cups of strong, bitter coffee, I told him everything. The chanting, the bones in the stream, the abandoned cabin, the journal. To his credit, Sheriff Turner listened without interruption, his face impassive. When I finished, he sat back, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. "That's quite a story, Mr. Wilson," he said finally. "In most places, I'd say you were spinning yarns or had one too many out there in the woods, but this is Bitterroot." He leaned forward, his voice low. "Things happen in these mountains, Mr. Wilson. Things that don't make it into the official reports. We've had missing hikers before, strange sightings, unexplained sounds. Most folks write it off as bears or mountain lions or overactive imaginations, but some of us know better." A chill ran down my spine. "You've seen it too," I said. It wasn't a question. Sheriff Turner nodded slowly. "Once, years ago. I was a young deputy, cocky as they come. Thought I knew these mountains like the back of my hand. Then one night I saw something, tall as a tree, moving through the forest like a shadow. Heard that chanting you mentioned. Nearly scared me out of my wits." He took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the cold bitterness. "Since then, I've kept my eyes and ears open, gathered what information I could. And I'll tell you this, Mr. Wilson, whatever's out there, it's old. Older than these mountains, maybe. And it doesn't take kindly to being disturbed." I pulled out the journal I'd found in the cabin, sliding it across the table to him. "What about this? Have you ever seen anything like it before?" Sheriff Turner's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "In the cabin, like I said. Why? Do you recognize it?" He closed the book carefully, as if afraid it might bite. "There are stories," he said slowly. "Old stories passed down by the local tribes. They speak of a book of secrets, a record of the Guardian and its ways. It was supposed to have been lost decades ago. If this is what I think it is, Mr. Wilson, you may have stumbled onto something bigger than either of us realized." Just then, the diner's door burst open. A young deputy, barely out of his teens by the look of him, rushed in. His face was pale, his eyes wild. "Sheriff," he gasped, "you need to come quick. We found them." "Found who?" Sheriff Turner was on his feet in an instant. "The missing hikers," the deputy said. "Or what's left of them." The drive to the trailhead was tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. As we bumped along the forest road, I couldn't help but feel we were driving towards something momentous, a turning point from which there would be no return. The scene at the trailhead was chaotic. Police cars and an ambulance had their lights flashing, casting eerie red and blue shadows through the trees. A small crowd of hikers and locals had gathered, held back by a hastily erected police line. Sheriff Turner flashed his badge, ushering me through with him. "He's with me," he growled at a deputy who looked like he might object. What I saw beyond the police line would haunt me for years to come. 2 body bags lay on the ground, surrounded by crime scene markers. But it was what was beyond them that caught my eye. There, carved into the trunk of a massive old pine, was a symbol. The twisted tree from the journal, its bark faces leering in the harsh light of the police floodlights, and all around, scratched into the dirt and nearby rocks, were words, the same phrase over and over: "The Guardian wakes, the forest remembers." As I stood there, staring at this macabre scene, a sound reached my ears. Faint at first, then growing stronger. That familiar, eerie chanting echoing through the trees. Sheriff Turner grabbed my arm, his face grim. "We need to go, now." As we hurried back to his car, I glanced over my shoulder. There, just for a moment, I saw it again. That impossibly tall figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. I knew then that this was far from over. The guardian of Bitterroot was awake, and somehow I was caught in the middle of its ancient, inscrutable purpose. As Sheriff Turner's car sped away from the scene, I clutched the old journal to my chest. Whatever answers we needed, I was sure they lay within its pages. And I had a feeling we were going to need those answers sooner rather than later. The guardian was calling, and like it or not, I had to answer. The next few days were a blur of activity. Sheriff Turner had set up a makeshift command center in the back room of the local library, away from prying eyes and curious ears. We spent hours poring over the journal, cross-referencing its cryptic entries with local legends and historical records. The journal, it turned out, was far more than just a record of one person's encounter with the Guardian. It was a compilation of accounts spanning centuries, passed down through generations of secret keepers. The writer of the last entry, the one dated 1932, had been merely the latest in a long line of custodians. As we delved deeper into its pages, a chilling picture began to emerge. The Guardian, or Nasher as it was sometimes called, was not just a protector of the forest. It was a judge, jury, and executioner for those who violated the sacred laws of the land. But what those laws were exactly remained frustratingly vague. Some entries spoke of trespassers being punished, others of offerings being made to appease the Guardian. There were accounts of entire logging camps disappearing overnight, of prospectors driven mad by ceaseless chanting, of hikers found wandering the woods, babbling about faces in the trees. "This doesn't make sense," I said one evening, rubbing my tired eyes. "If this thing is real, why hasn't anyone ever captured evidence of it? In this day and age, with cameras everywhere?" Sheriff Turner snorted. "You really think a being that's survived this long would let itself be caught on camera? Besides, look at this." He pointed to a passage in the journal. "The Guardian exists between worlds. It's not fully in our reality. That's why it's so hard to see, why it appears as a shadow or a trick of the light." I shook my head, still struggling to accept what we were dealing with. But why now? Why is it suddenly so active? And what does it want with me? The sheriff's face grew grim. "That's what worries me. According to this, the Guardian only becomes this active when there's a great threat to the forest, something big enough to rouse it from its slumber." A chill ran down my spine. "You don't think—" "I think," Sheriff Turner said slowly, "that whatever's coming, it's bigger than a few careless hikers or overzealous loggers. And for some reason it's chosen you to be involved." As if on cue, a deputy burst into the room. "Sheriff, you need to see this." We followed him out to the main street of the small town. What we saw made my blood run cold. Every tree lining the street had the Guardian's symbol carved into its trunk, and in the distance, echoing from the mountains, we could hear it. The chanting had begun again. Sheriff Turner turned to me, his face pale but determined. "I think it's time we stopped reacting and started acting. Whatever this thing wants, we need to face it head on." I nodded, fear and determination warring in my gut. "Where do we start?" The sheriff's gaze turned to the mountains looming over the town. "We go back to where it all began, your campsite, the cabin. We need to find the source of all this." As we prepared for what felt like a final confrontation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The Guardian, this ancient entity, had chosen to reveal itself now, after centuries of secrecy. Why? What had changed? Little did I know, the answer to that question would shake not just our small town, but the entire world to its core. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Sheriff Turner, myself, and a small team of deputies prepared for our expedition into the heart of the Bitterroot Mountains. We were armed with the journal, maps of the area, and enough supplies to last several days. Despite the sheriff's insistence, I refused to carry a gun. Something told me that conventional weapons would be useless against what we were about to face. As we drove towards my old campsite, I couldn't help but notice how the forest had changed. The trees seemed to press closer to the road, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I tried to focus on them. And underneath it all was a low, thrumming energy, as if the very earth was holding its breath in anticipation. We reached the turnoff to my campsite by midday. The old dirt road was nearly overgrown now, forcing us to continue on foot. As we hiked, I recounted my experiences to the group, pointing out landmarks I recognized. When we reached the stream where I had found the sack of bones, we all fell silent. The water ran clear and innocent, giving no hint of the horrors it had held. It was late afternoon by the time we reached the abandoned cabin. It looked even more decrepit than I remembered, the roof now partially caved in, but the symbol of the twisted tree was still clearly visible, carved into the weathered wood of the door. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Turner muttered, running his hand over the carving. "It's just like in the journal." We set up camp nearby, none of us willing to sleep inside the cabin itself. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But underneath it all was something else, a rhythm, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat. "Do you hear that?" I asked, seeing the others straining to listen. Sheriff Turner nodded grimly. "It's starting." As if triggered by his words, the chanting began. It was louder than I had ever heard it before, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The deputies huddled closer to the fire, their hands straying to their weapons. And then, at the edge of our camp, it appeared. The guardian of Bitterroot was even more awe-inspiring and terrifying than I remembered. It towered over us, its form shifting and swirling like living shadow. Where its face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of darkness, punctuated by pinpricks of light like distant stars. For a long moment nobody moved. We were frozen, caught between fear and wonder. Then, slowly, deliberately, the guardian raised one impossibly long arm and pointed, not at us, but beyond us, deeper into the forest. Sheriff Turner was the first to find his voice. I think it wants us to follow." Against every instinct of self-preservation, we did just that. We followed the guardian as it glided through the forest, the trees seeming to part before it. The chanting grew louder with every step, filling our heads until it was hard to think of anything else. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, we emerged into a massive clearing. At its center stood the largest tree I had ever seen, its trunk so wide it would have taken a dozen people to encircle it. And carved into its bark, covering every inch of its surface, was writing. The same script as in the journal, telling a story older than humanity itself. The guardian stopped before the tree, turning to face us. When it spoke, it wasn't with words, but with images and feelings that flooded our minds. We saw the forest as it had been thousands of years ago, pristine and untouched. We saw the first humans to enter this land, and the pact they made with the spirit of the forest. We saw centuries of balance, of give and take between humans and nature. And then we saw what was coming, a great destruction, fueled by greed and indifference. We saw the mountains torn open, the trees felled, the waters poisoned. We saw the end of everything the guardian had protected for millennia. As the vision faded, I understood at last. "It's not just about this forest," I gasped. "It's about all of it, the whole world." Sheriff Turner nodded, his face ashen. "It's showing us what will happen if we don't change course." The guardian raised its arms, and the giant tree began to glow with an inner light. Suddenly I knew what we had to do. "It's choosing us," I said, "to be the new guardians, to spread the message, to fight for the balance." One by one we stepped forward, placing our hands on the tree. As we did, knowledge flooded into us, the secrets of the forest, the ways of nature, the delicate balance of all things. We became part of something greater than ourselves, a link in a chain stretching back to the dawn of time. When it was over, the guardian was gone, but we could feel its presence all around us, in every tree, every leaf, every breath of wind. We were forever changed, entrusted with a mission greater than any we could have imagined. As we made our way back to town, I knew that our work was just beginning. We had a message to spread, a world to change. The guardian of Bitterroot had awoken us to a higher purpose, and we would not let it down. Years have passed since that fateful night in the heart of the Bitterroot Mountains. The world has changed, slowly but surely. Our message spread, first locally, then nationally, and finally globally. We spoke of balance, of respect for the natural world, of the interconnectedness of all things. It wasn't easy. There were those who laughed, those who threatened, those who tried to silence us. But with every passing day, more people listened, more people understood. The logging companies that had planned to strip the mountains bare were stopped. The mines that would have poisoned the streams were never dug. Instead, the Bitterroot Mountains became a symbol of conservation, a place where humans and nature existed in harmony. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I return to that clearing with the ancient tree. I place my hand on its bark and feel the pulse of the forest. And in the whisper of the wind through the leaves, I hear the guardian's voice reminding me of the oath we took and the duty we bear. I am Joseph Wilson, once a simple insurance adjuster, now a guardian of nature's balance. My camping trip may have ended, but my true journey had only just begun. And as I stand here under the vast canopy of stars, I know that as long as there are those who remember, who respect, and who protect, the spirit of the forest will never truly sleep. The guardian of Bitterroot watches over us all, a silent sentinel in a world learning at last to listen to the wisdom of the ancient forests. I don't usually make a habit of discussing my past, but there's something about the silence of the Oregon wilderness that compels me to talk. Maybe it's the solitude or the endless horizon that makes a man reflect on the paths he's taken. My name is Daniel Hawthorne, and for most of my life I was a civil engineer. I worked on urban development projects, reshaping cities, making them more livable. It was good work, honest work. But after my wife Sarah passed away 3 years ago, I lost my taste for city life. The day Sarah died was like any other. We had breakfast together, kissed goodbye as I left for work. I remember her smile, the way the morning light caught her hair. I didn't know it would be the last time I'd see her alive. A drunk driver ran a red light that afternoon. By the time I got to the hospital, it was too late. After that, everything changed. The city that had once felt like home became a maze of memories, each street corner and building a reminder of what I'd lost. The hustle of concrete and steel, the incessant noise, it all became too much. I tried to lose myself in work, but even that felt hollow. Every project, every blueprint seemed pointless without her to share it with. So, 6 months after Sarah's death, I made a decision. I sold our house, the one we'd lovingly restored together, packed up what little I wanted to keep, and bought an old RV. It wasn't much to look at, a 1985 Winnebago Chieftain, faded blue paint and all, but it was sturdy and reliable. I named her Sarah's Dream because my wife had always talked about us retiring and traveling the country together. That was the beginning of my new life. I started camping in the most remote places I could find, seeking out spots where the map showed nothing but green. It became my way of escaping, of trying to connect with something real, something that didn't remind me of what I'd lost. Over the past 2.5 years, I've crisscrossed the country, from the sun-baked deserts of Arizona to the lush forests of Vermont. I've seen sunrises over the Grand Canyon and watched the northern lights dance across Alaskan skies. But there was always a restlessness in me, a sense that I was running from something I couldn't outrun. This time, I'd driven to a spot deep in the Mount Hood National Forest, a place few people know about. I'd heard about it from an old-timer at a gas station in Sisters, Oregon. He'd told me about a hidden clearing near a creek, far off the beaten path, where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sky. "If you're looking for solitude, son," he'd said, his eyes twinkling beneath bushy white eyebrows, "that's the place to find it. But be careful. Sometimes the forest has a way of showing you things you might not want to see." I'd laughed it off at the time, thinking he was just spinning yarns to entertain a passing stranger. But as I navigated the narrow, winding forest roads, his words kept coming back to me. The further I drove, the more the trees seemed to close in, creating a tunnel of green that swallowed up the sunlight. It was late afternoon by the time I finally found the clearing. The old-timer's directions had been spot on. And as I pulled the RV into the small open space near the creek, I felt a sense of anticipation mixed with relief. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I could hear the creek babbling nearby, a soothing counterpoint to the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I stepped out of the RV, stretching my stiff muscles after the long drive. The tension in my shoulders, a constant companion these past years, began to ease as I breathed in the cool, clean air. This was what I'd been searching for, a place so remote, so untouched, that it felt like stepping into another world. I set up camp quickly with the efficiency of someone who's done this 100 times before. Firewood collected, a small fire pit dug, and my camping chair positioned to face the creek. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something. But there was nothing there, just the endless sea of trees. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, I sat in my chair, watching the water rush over rocks. The peace I'd been searching for, it was here. I could feel it settling into my bones, a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since Sarah died. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, just some beans and bacon, nothing fancy. I hadn't seen another soul all day, and that was fine by me. The less human contact, the better. After dinner, I sat back in my chair, sipping on a can of cheap beer, listening to the crackling fire and the distant hoot of an owl. The stars began to peek out, one by one, filling the sky like diamonds on black velvet. I thought about how this was the first time in a long while that I felt a little bit of peace. Maybe, I thought, I could finally start to heal here, in this quiet corner of the world. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible over the crackling of the fire. A low, rhythmic thud, like something heavy walking in the distance. I dismissed it initially, figuring it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. But then it came again, a little closer this time. Thud. I froze, my hand tightening around the can of beer. There was something wrong about that sound, something that didn't belong in these woods. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know the usual nighttime noises, the rustle of small animals, the call of nocturnal birds. This was different. I stood up slowly, trying to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the other side of the creek, deeper in the forest. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was pitch black. I strained my ears, but the sound had stopped. Just the wind now, rustling the leaves. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing, maybe a bear or an elk, though I knew it didn't sound like either. Still, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The old-timer's words came back to me. Sometimes the forest has a way of showing you things you might not want to see. I decided to call it a night, dousing the fire and heading into the RV. I locked the door behind me, a habit I picked up more for peace of mind than out of necessity, and settled into the small bed at the back of the RV. Sleep came slowly, the thud still echoing in my mind. I finally drifted off, but it wasn't restful. My dreams were fragmented, filled with shadows moving through the trees and that incessant, ominous thudding. I woke up with a start in the middle of the night, my heart racing. Something had slammed into the side of the RV, hard. The whole vehicle shook with the impact. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat, listening intently. The night was dead silent, the kind of silence that's unnatural, suffocating. I waited, every muscle tense, for the next impact, but it didn't come. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed and crept to the window, peeking out through the small gap in the curtains. At first I saw nothing but darkness and the faint outline of the trees. Then movement caught my eye. A shadow, large and hunched over near the creek. My breath caught in my throat. It was too big to be a bear, too bulky for any animal I was familiar with. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing, but I couldn't. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before. The creature, whatever it was hunched low to the ground, its limbs unnaturally long, its back curved in a way that seemed painful. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it was searching for something. I pulled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was it? I'd spent years in the wilderness, seen all kinds of wildlife, but this was different. I couldn't just sit there waiting for it to decide to attack again. I had a shotgun stowed under the bed, an old Remington my father had given me years ago. I hadn't fired it in ages, but I wasn't about to let whatever was out there get the better of me. I grabbed the gun, loaded it with shaking hands, and moved back to the window. The creature was still there, closer now, its movement slow and deliberate, like it was testing the air, searching for something. Its head swiveled slowly, and I realized with a jolt that it didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. What kind of thing doesn't have a face? It suddenly stopped moving and straightened up, its full height now visible. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, its body covered in what looked like matted fur or some kind of rough, spiky hide. My finger hovered over the trigger, but I hesitated. What if I missed? What if I only succeeded in pissing it off? But I couldn't just sit there. I had to do something. I opened the window slowly, aiming the shotgun at the thing. It didn't move, just stood there, its head cocked to one side like it was listening. I took a deep breath, steadied my shaking hands, and fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space of the RV, and the creature let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but something low and vibrating, a sound that rattled my bones. It stumbled back, clutching its side, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then it straightened up again, its faceless head turning slowly toward the RV. Panic surged through me. I fired again and again, but it was like the creature absorbed the shots. It staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it started moving toward the RV, faster now, its limbs unfolding in a grotesque, unnatural way. I fumbled with the shotgun, trying to reload, but my hands were trembling too much. The creature was almost at the door now, its movements jerky like a puppet being yanked on strings. In a last-ditch effort, I threw open the door of the RV and fired point-blank at the thing. The blast sent it staggering back, and this time it went down, crashing into the ground with a thud that shook the earth. I didn't wait to see if it would get up again. I grabbed my keys, started the RV, and gunned it, tearing out of that clearing as fast as I could. The trees whipped past in the darkness, branches scraping against the sides of the RV as I navigated the narrow forest road. I drove until dawn, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, a small place called Parkdale. I was exhausted, my hands still shaking, but I knew I had to report what had happened. I went straight to the sheriff's office, a small building on the main street. The deputy on duty, a young guy named Mike, looked at me like I was crazy when I started telling my story. But as I showed him my trembling hands, the terror still evident in my eyes, he began to take me seriously. Sheriff Evelyn Carter arrived shortly after, a stern-looking woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp blue eyes. She listened to my story without interruption, her face unreadable. When I finished, she exchanged a look with Deputy Mike that I couldn't quite interpret. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice calm but authoritative, "we're going to send out a search party to investigate your campsite. Can you show us on a map exactly where you were?" I nodded, still shaken, and pointed out the location on a large map of the Mount Hood National Forest that hung on the wall. Sheriff Carter made a note of it, then turned back to me. "We'll head out there right away. In the meantime, I suggest you get some rest. There's a motel just down the street. We'll contact you as soon as we have any information." I wanted to argue, to insist on going with them, but exhaustion was catching up with me. I nodded, thanked them, and made my way to the motel. Sleep didn't come easily, despite my fatigue. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that faceless creature, heard that bone-rattling sound it had made. It was late afternoon when Sheriff Carter came to see me. Her expression was grave as she sat down across from me in the small motel room. "Mr. Hawthorne, we found your campsite," she began, her voice carefully neutral. It was torn apart, like something big had rampaged through it. I felt a chill run down my spine. "And the creature?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sheriff Carter shook her head. "No sign of it, but—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "We did find bloodstains on the ground, a lot of blood. We're having it analyzed now." Relief washed over me. They had found evidence. I wasn't crazy. "So you believe me?" I asked. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Hawthorne, I've been sheriff in these parts for over 20 years. I've seen things in these woods that I can't explain. I'm not saying I know what you encountered out there, but I believe you saw something." She stood up, straightening her uniform. "We're going to keep investigating. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay in town. We might have more questions." After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. The reality of what had happened was starting to sink in. I wasn't going back there, that was for sure. I'd done my share of wilderness camping, and I think it was time to find a new way to escape. Maybe, I thought, it was time to stop running, to face the grief I'd been trying to outrun for the past 3 years. Sarah wouldn't have wanted me to live like this, always on the move, always alone. She would have wanted me to find a way to live again, not just exist. As the sun set outside my motel window, I made a decision. Once this was all over, once the investigation was complete, I'd find a place to settle down. Maybe a small town like this one, where the wilderness was close but not overwhelming. A place where I could start to rebuild my life. The creature in the woods had terrified me, yes. But in a strange way, it had also awakened something in me, a desire to live, truly live, that I thought had died with Sarah. Whatever that thing was, it had shown me that there were still things in this world that could surprise me, shock me out of the numb existence I'd been living. As I lay back on the bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for a future that, while different from what I'd planned with Sarah, could still be meaningful. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I was ready to face it. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews and restless nights at the motel. Sheriff Carter kept me updated on their investigation, but progress was slow. The blood samples they'd collected from the campsite had come back with inconclusive results. According to the lab, the DNA didn't match any known species in their database. "It's not human, and it's not any animal we can identify," Sheriff Carter told me, her brow furrowed in confusion. "We've sent samples to a specialized lab in Portland for further analysis, but it might take weeks to get results." Meanwhile, news of the incident had spread through the small town of Parkdale. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling eyes on me, hearing whispers behind my back. Some people looked at me with fear, others with curiosity, and a few with outright disbelief. On my 3rd day in town, I was having breakfast at the local diner when an old man approached my table. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice gravelly with age. I gestured to the empty seat across from me, and he sat down with a grunt. "Name's Frank," he said, extending a gnarled hand. "Frank Redwood. Heard about what happened to you out in the forest." I shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip despite his age. "Daniel Hawthorne," I replied. "And yeah, seems like everyone's heard about it by now." Frank nodded, his eyes never leaving my face. "You're not the first, you know," he said quietly. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" Frank leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "These woods, they're old. Older than any of us can imagine. And they've got secrets, Mr. Hawthorne. Secrets that don't take kindly to being disturbed." I wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of an old man, but after what I'd seen, I found myself hanging on every word. "Back in '73, Frank continued, "my hunting buddy and I saw something out there, something that shouldn't exist. Tall as a tree it was, with limbs that moved all wrong. We hightailed it out of there and never went back to that part of the forest again." "Did you report it?" I asked, my food forgotten. Frank snorted. "To who? The sheriff back then would have laughed us out of town. No, we kept it to ourselves, but over the years I've heard whispers, other folks who've seen things they can't explain. Most of them leave town shortly after. Can't blame them, really." I sat back, my mind reeling. If Frank was telling the truth, then whatever I'd encountered wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger, something that had been going on for decades. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Frank's eyes softened. "Because you look like a man who needs answers, and because I'm tired of carrying this secret. You're the first person in years who might actually believe me." Before I could respond, Sheriff Carter entered the diner. Her eyes scanned the room before landing on me. She made her way over to our table, nodding a greeting to Frank. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice tight, "we need to talk, privately." I thanked Frank for the conversation and followed the sheriff out of the diner. She led me to her cruiser, gesturing for me to get in. "We found something," she said as she pulled out onto the main street. "Something I think you need to see for yourself." We drove in silence for about 20 minutes, heading deeper into the forest. Finally, we turned onto a narrow dirt road that I recognized. It was the same one I'd fled down that night. "Are we going back to my campsite?" I asked, anxiety building in my chest. Sheriff Carter shook her head. "Not exactly. We found something about a mile from where you were camped. Something that might explain what you saw." We pulled into a small clearing where several police vehicles and a large white van were parked. Men in hazmat suits were moving in and out of the tree line, carrying equipment I didn't recognize. "What's going on here?" I asked as we got out of the car. "Follow me," Sheriff Carter said, leading me towards the trees. As we pushed through the undergrowth, I began to notice a strange smell, acrid and chemical, unlike anything I'd encountered in nature before. Then suddenly we broke through into another clearing, and I stopped dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing was what looked like the wreckage of some kind of aircraft. But it wasn't like any plane or helicopter I'd ever seen. The metal was a dull gray, with no visible seams or rivets. Its shape was all wrong, sleek and organic, more like a giant seed pod than any man-made vehicle. "What the hell is that?" I breathed. Sheriff Carter's face was grim. "We're not sure, but based on the plant growth around it, it's been here for decades. And Mr. Hawthorne," she turned to face me, her eyes deadly serious, "we found tracks leading away from it, tracks that match the description of the creature you saw." My mind was spinning. An alien craft? It seemed impossible, and yet, after what I'd seen, could I really rule anything out? "There's more," Sheriff Carter continued. "We found this." She handed me a small object about the size of a playing card. It was made of the same strange metal as the craft, with intricate patterns etched into its surface. As I held it, it began to warm in my hand, and the patterns started to glow with a soft blue light. "What is it?" I asked, mesmerized by the shifting patterns. "We don't know," Sheriff Carter admitted, "but it reacts to human touch, and Mr. Hawthorne, you're the first person it's responded to like that." I looked up from the object to meet her gaze. "What does this mean?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but I think you just became a key part of this investigation. Whatever's going on here, whatever that thing in the woods is, I think you're connected to it somehow." As I stood there, holding the strange artifact and staring at the wreckage of what could only be an alien craft, I realized that my life had changed irrevocably. The peaceful solitude I'd been seeking in the wilderness had led me to something far bigger and more mysterious than I could have ever imagined. I thought about Sarah, about the life we'd planned together, and about how far I'd strayed from that path. But standing here on the precipice of what felt like a monumental discovery, I felt more alive than I had in years. "All right," I said, looking back at Sheriff Carter. "What do we do now?" She gave me a small, determined smile. "Now, Mr. Hawthorne, we find some answers." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The clearing with the crashed craft became the center of a major operation, with government agencies swooping in to take control. Sheriff Carter and I were interviewed countless times, recounting every detail of our experiences. The small artifact I had activated became a subject of intense study. Scientists were baffled by its properties. It responded to my touch in ways they couldn't explain, revealing complex holographic images that seemed to depict star systems and technologies beyond our current understanding. As for the creature I had encountered, there were more sightings reported in the area. Search parties were organized, but it remained elusive. The forests around Mount Hood became a hotbed of activity, with researchers, military personnel, and curious onlookers all drawn by the rumors of something extraterrestrial in our midst. Through it all, I found myself at the center of the storm. The artifact's unique response to me made me a person of interest to everyone involved in the investigation. I spent long hours in makeshift labs, subjected to a battery of tests, as scientists tried to understand why I could activate the alien technology when others couldn't. It was during one of these sessions, about a month after the initial discovery, that we had our breakthrough. As I held the artifact, concentrating on the shifting patterns, something clicked in my mind. Suddenly I could understand the images it was projecting. They weren't just star maps, they were instructions. "It's a key," I said, my voice filled with awe. "A key to understanding their language, their technology, and I think I know how to use it." The lead scientist, Dr. Elena Rossi, looked at me with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. "How is that possible? We've been studying this for weeks without any progress." I shook my head, unable to explain it myself. "I don't know. It's like the information was always there in my head, and the artifact just unlocked it." Over the next few days, I worked closely with Dr. Rossi and her team, helping them decipher the alien language and technology. It was exhausting work, but exhilarating. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a purpose, like I was part of something important. As we unraveled the mysteries of the artifact, a picture began to emerge. The craft that had crashed wasn't just a vehicle. It was a seed ship sent to Earth thousands of years ago to study our planet and its inhabitants. The creature I had encountered was a guardian, a being engineered to protect the ship and its mission. But something had gone wrong. The ship had crashed, damaging its systems. The guardian, cut off from its home and its purpose, had been wandering the forests for millennia, confused and alone. "We need to find it," I told Sheriff Carter and Dr. Rossi. "Not to capture or study, but to communicate, to help it." They were hesitant at first, but as I explained what I had learned from the artifact, they came around to my point of view. We organized a small team, myself, Sheriff Carter, Dr. Rossi, and a few trusted others, and set out into the forest. Using the artifact as a guide, we trekked deep into the wilderness, further than any of the previous search parties had gone. As we walked, I felt a growing sense of anticipation, like we were approaching something momentous. Finally, after hours of hiking, we entered a small glade. There, standing in the center, was the creature. Up close, in the light of day, it was both terrifying and beautiful. Its body shimmed with an iridescent sheen, and what I had thought was matted fur was actually a complex exoskeleton. Everyone tensed, reaching for weapons, but I held up a hand to stop them. Slowly I approached the creature. The artifact held out before me like a beacon. The being turned its featureless face towards me, and I felt a tremor of fear. But then the artifact began to glow, brighter than ever before. The creature cocked its head, as if listening to a sound only it could hear. And then, to everyone's amazement, it spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts and images that bloomed in my mind. It told us its story, of a mission to understand and protect, of the long millennia of confusion and loneliness after the crash. It spoke of watching humanity grow and change, always from the shadows, never able to reach out or make contact. As its story unfolded, I felt tears running down my cheeks. The creature's loneliness, its isolation, resonated with my own grief and solitude. In that moment, I understood why the artifact had responded to me, why I had been chosen for this moment. We were the same, this being and I, lost, adrift, in need of connection and purpose. With the help of the artifact, I conveyed our own story to the creature. I told it of our curiosity, our desire to understand, our hope for connection with other intelligent life. And I offered it something it had been without for thousands of years: companionship. The next few hours were a blur of communication and revelation. The creature, which we came to call the Guardian, shared with us knowledge that would revolutionize our understanding of the universe. In return, we offered it a place among us, a chance to fulfill its mission of learning and exchange in a way it never could before. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I felt a profound sense of change. The Guardian, no longer alone, seemed to stand taller, its movements more fluid and purposeful. And I, the man who had come to the wilderness to escape, found that I had instead been led to the greatest adventure of my life. We made our way back to the research base, the Guardian walking peacefully among us. I knew that what lay ahead would be challenging, explaining this to the world, navigating the political and social implications of first contact. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to face whatever came. As we emerged from the forest, the last light of day painting the sky in brilliant hues, I thought of Sarah. I imagined her smile, the way she always encouraged me to embrace the unknown. She would have loved this, I thought, and for once the memory brought more joy than pain. I looked at the Guardian, at Sheriff Carter and Dr. Rossi, at the artifact that had changed everything. I had come to the wilderness seeking solitude, seeking an escape from my grief. Instead, I had found connection with an alien being, with the people around me, and with a part of myself I thought I had lost. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and wonders I could scarcely imagine. But as I stood there, on the threshold of a new chapter in human history, I felt ready to explore, to learn, to live again. The wilderness had indeed shown me things I never expected to see, but more importantly, it had shown me the way forward, and for that I would be forever grateful. 5 years have passed since that fateful day in the forest. The world has changed in ways I never could have imagined, and I've changed with it. The revelation of the Guardian's existence and the knowledge it shared sent shockwaves through every facet of human society. There were those who feared this new reality, who called for isolation and rejection of the alien presence. But there were many more who embraced the opportunity for growth and understanding. I found myself at the forefront of this new era, working alongside Dr. Rossi and a team of international scientists to unlock the secrets of the Guardian's technology. The advancements we've made in clean energy, medicine, and space exploration in just a few short years are nothing short of miraculous. Parkdale, once a quiet logging town, has become a hub of scientific research and interspecies cooperation. The Guardian, no longer alone, has been joined by others of its kind, drawn to Earth by the reactivation of the seed ship's beacon. They work alongside us, sharing their knowledge and learning from us in return. Sheriff Carter retired last year, but not before playing a crucial role in establishing new protocols for human-alien interaction. She and I have remained close friends, often reminiscing about the day that changed everything over beers at the now famous diner where we first discussed the incident. As for me, I've found a new purpose. I split my time between working with the research team and leading educational programs that help people understand and connect with our new alien neighbors. The RV that was once my escape pod now serves as a mobile classroom, traveling to communities across the country to spread knowledge and foster understanding. But perhaps the most significant change has been within myself. The grief that once consumed me, that drove me into the wilderness, has softened. It's still there, a part of who I am, but it no longer defines me. I've learned to carry Sarah's memory not as a burden, but as a source of strength and inspiration. I've even found love again, unexpectedly, with Dr. Rossi. Elena, her passion for discovery, her boundless curiosity, reminded me so much of Sarah. Our relationship grew slowly, naturally, born out of shared experiences and mutual respect. We were married last spring, in the very glade where I first communicated with the Guardian. It was a small ceremony, attended by a unique mix of humans and aliens. As we exchanged vows, I felt Sarah's presence, not as a ghost of the past, but as a blessing for the future. Tonight, as I sit on the porch of our home on the outskirts of Parkdale, watching the sunset behind Mount Hood, I reflect on the journey that brought me here. The man who drove into these woods 5 years ago, lost and alone, seems like a stranger now. I hear Elena's footsteps behind me, and she places a hand on my shoulder. "Are you ready?" she asks. I nod, standing up to join her. We're due at the research center for a late-night communication session with a newly arrived alien delegation. As we walk hand in hand towards the car, I glance back at the forest. The trees stand silent and majestic as always, but I know they no longer hide any mysteries from me. The wilderness that once seemed like an escape has become a gateway to the universe. I squeeze Elena's hand, feeling the warmth of the wedding band on her finger. "Let's go," I say, smiling. "We've got a whole universe to explore." As we drive towards the research center, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, I feel a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that brought me here, for the love I've found, and for the endless possibilities that lie ahead. The wilderness showed me things I never expected to see, but it also showed me the way home. And now, with each new day, each new discovery, I'm reminded that the greatest adventures are those we never see coming. My name is James Jones, and I am 68 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 14th, 2003, a date that's seared into my memory like a brand on cattle. I was a long-haul truck driver back then, rolling through the back roads of Idaho, delivering produce to a small-town grocery store chain. I'd been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, and I'd seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It started as a routine trip. I'd left Boise early in the morning with a trailer full of apples and potatoes. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as I pulled out of the depot. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and diesel fuel. I remember thinking it was going to be a good day. My destination was Grangeville, a small town tucked away in the mountains. The route was familiar, long stretches of highway with barely any other cars, winding through dense forests and past the occasional abandoned farmhouse. It was just me, the truck, and the open road. I had my thermos of coffee, my playlist of classic rock tunes, and enough beef jerky to last me through the apocalypse. Life was good. As I drove, I thought about my life, as I often did on these long hauls. My wife Sarah had passed away 5 years ago, and our kids were all grown up with families of their own. Trucking had become my way of coping, of staying busy and useful. There was something comforting about the monotony of the road, the steady hum of the engine, and the ever-changing landscape outside my window. The first few hours of the trip were uneventful. I passed through small towns with names like Horseshoe Bend and New Meadows, watching as the terrain gradually became more rugged and mountainous. The forests grew thicker, the road narrower. It was beautiful country, but isolated, the kind of place where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. About halfway through my trip, I pulled over at a rest stop near Cottonwood. I needed a break, and the truck needed fuel. The rest stop was deserted as usual, just a couple of vending machines and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a decade. I stretched my legs, grabbed a soda, and leaned against the truck, enjoying the quiet. The silence was almost eerie. No birds singing, no wind rustling through the trees, just the occasional creak of my truck as it cooled down. I found myself thinking about all the stories I'd heard over the years from other truckers. Tales of ghostly hitchhikers, mysterious lights in the sky, and creatures that shouldn't exist. I'd always laughed them off as tall tales, but standing there in that empty rest stop, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. As I was about to get back in the cab, I noticed a car parked a little way off, an old beat-up Chevy. It hadn't been there when I pulled in. I could see someone sitting inside, but they didn't move or acknowledge me. A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I shrugged it off and got back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. An hour later, the sun was setting and the road was getting darker. I was approaching a particularly isolated stretch when my CB radio crackled to life. It was unusual to get any chatter out here, so I turned up the volume, curious. "Breaker, breaker, anyone out there?" The voice was shaky, almost desperate. "Yeah, this is Bluebird. What's up?" I replied, using my handle. "Bluebird, this is Hitchhiker. I'm stranded out near mile marker 78. Can you give me a hand?" I hesitated. I didn't usually pick up hitchhikers or stranded motorists. It was too risky in this day and age, but something in the guy's voice made me think he really needed help. And mile marker 78 was just a few miles ahead. "All right, hitchhiker, I'm close by. I'll be there in 10. "Thanks, Bluebird, I owe you one." As I approached mile marker 78, I saw the Chevy again, parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. It was the same car from the rest stop, I was sure of it. My gut told me to keep driving, but I couldn't bring myself to leave someone stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over and climbed out of the cab, leaving the engine running. The driver's door of the Chevy opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lanky, with a scruffy beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice matching the one I'd heard on the radio. "Car broke down and my phone's out of juice. Mind if I catch a ride to the next town?" "Sure, hop in," I said, still cautious but figuring I couldn't leave the guy out here. He climbed into the passenger seat and I pulled back onto the road. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the tires on the asphalt. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as fog. "You got a name?" I asked, trying to break the ice. "Call me Jack," he said, staring straight ahead. "All right, Jack. Where you headed?" "Anywhere but here," he muttered. That should have been my first warning, but I ignored it. As we drove, I noticed Jack kept glancing back at the road behind us like he was expecting someone to follow. It was making me uneasy. "You running from something?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just trying to get away, that's all," he replied, not offering any more details. The night grew darker and the road seemed to stretch on forever. I decided to pull over at a truck stop up ahead to grab a coffee and use the restroom. Jack stayed in the truck, saying he'd wait for me. Inside the truck stop, I grabbed my coffee and chatted with the clerk for a bit, trying to shake off the weird vibe from my passenger. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floor. A few other truckers were scattered around, hunched over plates of greasy food or staring blankly at the small TV in the corner. I took my time, hoping that when I got back to the truck, Jack would be gone. But as I pushed open the door and stepped back into the night, I saw my rig right where I'd left it, looming in the darkness like a sleeping giant. When I got back to the truck, Jack was indeed gone. The passenger door was wide open and there was no sign of him. I looked around, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. I was about to call it in when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark stain on the passenger seat, still wet. It looked like blood. My heart started racing. What the hell had happened? Where was Jack and whose blood was that? I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, my hand shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. I decided to keep driving, thinking maybe Jack had just freaked out and taken off. But the longer I drove, the more I felt like something was very wrong. The darkness outside seemed to press in on all sides, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding something sinister. About 20 miles down the road, my headlights caught something up ahead. It was another truck, overturned and blocking most of the lane. I slowed down and pulled over to see if anyone needed help. As I approached the wreck, I saw 2 bodies lying on the ground, covered in blood. It looked like a brutal attack, not just a crash. My stomach turned, and I reached for my phone to call 911, but there was no signal out here. I was on my own, standing in the middle of nowhere with 2 dead bodies and a growing sense of dread. I heard a noise behind me and spun around, but there was nothing, just a dark, empty road and the trees swaying in the wind. I hurried back to my truck, my mind racing. What the hell had happened here? And where was Jack? I got back in the cab and locked the doors again, my hands shaking. I decided to keep driving until I found a place with a signal to call for help. But as I drove, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see Jack or someone else lurking behind me. Then, just as I was starting to think I was losing it, I saw him. A figure standing by the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. It was Jack, covered in blood and holding something that glinted in the light. A knife. I swerved to avoid him and floored the gas pedal, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached a small diner on the outskirts of Grangeville. I ran inside, breathless and terrified, and told the staff to call the police. The cops arrived about 20 minutes later, and I told them everything. The stranded car, the hitchhiker, the bloody truck, and the figure with the knife. They took my statement and went out to investigate, but I never found out what happened next. All I know is that Jack was gone, and so were the bodies from the wreck. I finished my delivery the next day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took a few days off, trying to process what had happened. When I finally got back on the road, I avoided that route like the plague. Years have passed since that night, but it still haunts me. I often wonder who Jack really was and what he was running from. I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, looking for his next ride. And I wonder if I'll ever truly be able to put that night behind me. Sometimes late at night when I'm driving through lonely stretches of highway, I think I see him. A tall, lanky figure standing by the side of the road, thumb out, waiting for someone to stop. And in those moments, I grip the steering wheel a little tighter, press down on the gas a little harder, and remind myself that some strangers are best left alone. In the weeks following that nightmarish encounter, I found myself caught up in a whirlwind of police interviews and sleepless nights. The local authorities seemed skeptical of my story at first. I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was just another trucker with an overactive imagination, spinning yarns to break up the monotony of the long hauls. But as they dug deeper, things started to get weird. The abandoned Chevy I'd seen at the rest stop, it had been reported stolen 3 states over, 2 days before my encounter with Jack. The owner was found dead in his home, the victim of a brutal stabbing. The overturned truck with the 2 bodies? It matched the description of a rig that had gone missing the previous week, along with its driver and his partner. The families were devastated, looking for answers that no one seemed to have. I spent hours with a police sketch artist, trying to capture every detail of Jack's face. When they finally showed me the finished drawing, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was him, all right. Those cold eyes, that unkempt beard. It was like he was staring right at me from the page. The sketch was circulated to law enforcement agencies across the country. Weeks passed, then months. Leads came in, but nothing solid. Jack, if that was even his real name, seemed to have vanished into thin air. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every time I got behind the wheel, I found myself scanning the roadside, half expecting to see Jack's lanky figure emerging from the shadows. Every hitchhiker, every stranded motorist, became a potential threat in my mind. About 6 months after the incident, I was making a run through Nevada when my truck broke down. It was the middle of the night, in a stretch of desert so empty it made Idaho look like New York City. As I climbed down from the cab to check the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. I popped the hood and was leaning in, trying to figure out what was wrong, when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. My heart started racing. I turned slowly, half expecting to see that old beat-up Chevy pulling up behind me. Instead, it was another trucker, an older guy with a white beard and a kind face. He offered to help, and together we managed to get my rig running again. As he was about to leave, he paused and gave me a long look. "You're that guy, aren't you?" he said. "The one who picked up the killer hitchhiker in Idaho?" I nodded, surprised. Word had spread through the trucking community, it seemed. The old trucker shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive, son. There are things out there on these roads, things most people wouldn't believe. You be careful, you hear?" As I watched his taillights disappear into the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the long, lonely highways of America might be hiding. A year after my encounter with Jack, I found myself sitting in a church basement in Boise, surrounded by a circle of people who looked as haunted as I felt. It was a support group for people who'd had encounters with the unexplained, the dangerous, the things that lurk in the shadows of our world. There was Mary, a waitress who swore she'd served coffee to a man who vanished into thin air when she turned her back. Tom, a forest ranger who'd seen something in the woods that he couldn't explain, something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't human. And Sarah, a young mother who'd narrowly escaped an encounter with a serial killer who'd been terrorizing her small town. As I listened to their stories, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since that night on the highway, I didn't feel alone. These people understood what it was like to have your world turned upside down, to question everything you thought you knew about reality. When it was my turn to speak, the words came pouring out. I told them everything, about Jack, about the blood in my truck, about the bodies on the road. As I spoke, I saw recognition in their eyes. They believed me without question or hesitation. After the meeting, Sarah approached me. "Your story," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man you described, I think I've seen him." My blood ran cold. "Where?" I asked. "About a month ago. I was driving home late one night and I saw a man standing by the side of the road. Tall, thin, with a scruffy beard. He was holding something. I thought it was a knife. I didn't stop, I just drove faster. I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that I wasn't crazy, that Jack was real. And fear because if Sarah had seen him, it meant he was still out there somewhere. As the months turned into years, I found myself at a crossroads. The highways that had once been my home now felt alien and threatening. Every mile brought a new worry, a new potential danger. I'd lost the peace I'd once found in the solitude of long-haul driving. My kids noticed the change in me. They urged me to retire, to come stay with them and their families. "You've done enough, Dad," my daughter said during one of our weekly phone calls. "You don't have to keep pushing yourself like this." Part of me wanted to take them up on their offer. to settle down in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by family, far from the dark highways and the memories that haunted them. But another part of me, a part I didn't fully understand, knew I couldn't walk away. Not yet. There was something unfinished about my encounter with Jack, questions that needed answers, and deep down I knew that as long as he was out there, I couldn't truly rest. So I made a decision. I would keep driving, but with a purpose. I would keep my eyes open, my ears to the ground. I would talk to other truckers, share information, build a network. If Jack was still out there, still haunting the highways, I was going to find him. I didn't know what I'd do if I ever came face to face with him again, but I knew I couldn't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. One way or another, I needed closure. Over the next few years, I became something of a legend in the trucking community. The old man who'd survived an encounter with the highway killer who was still out there searching for answers. Some thought I was crazy. Others admired my determination, but most importantly, people started to talk to me. I heard stories from all over the country. A waitress in Texas who'd served a man matching Jack's description, only to find a bloody knife left behind on the table. A gas station attendant in Montana who'd had a strange encounter with a customer who asked oddly specific questions about isolated roads and police patrols. A hitchhiker in New Mexico who'd narrowly escaped being picked up by a man whose cold eyes and cruel smile had sent chills down his spine. Each story, each sighting, I marked on a map in my truck. Over time, a pattern began to emerge. Jack, or whoever he was, seemed to be moving in a rough circle through the western states, never staying in one place for long, always on the move. I shared my findings with a few trusted friends in law enforcement, but they were hesitant to act on what they saw as unreliable information. "We can't chase ghosts," one detective told me. But to me, Jack was far from a ghost. He was flesh and blood, leaving a trail of fear and violence in his wake. It was a crisp autumn night in 2008 when I had my next close encounter with Jack. I was driving through a remote part of Oregon, the kind of place where the forests crowd right up to the edge of the highway and the only light comes from your headlights and the stars above. I'd stopped at a small diner for a late dinner, one of those 24-hour places that cater almost exclusively to truckers and other night owls. As I was finishing my coffee, I overheard a conversation at the counter that made my blood run cold. "Yeah, picked him up about 50 miles back," a young trucker was saying. "Skinny guy, beard, kind of intense looking. Said his car broke down." I turned slowly, trying not to draw attention to myself. The trucker was talking to the waitress who was refilling his coffee cup. "Where'd you drop him?" she asked. "That's the weird thing," the trucker replied. "We got to talking, and he seemed real interested in my route. Asked if I was heading to California. When I said no, he just asked me to pull over, middle of nowhere. Said he'd wait for another ride." I didn't wait to hear more. I threw some money on the table and hurried out to my truck. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. Jack was here, close by, and he was looking for a ride to California. I spent the next few hours driving up and down that stretch of highway, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the looming trees. As dawn broke, I pulled into a rest stop, exhausted and on edge. That's when I saw it, a message carved into the wall of the bathroom stall. "Nice to see you again, Bluebird. Keep on trucking." I stumbled out of the bathroom, my heart pounding. He'd been here, he'd seen me, and worst of all, he knew I was looking for him. For the next few months, I felt like I was losing my mind. Every shadow on the road looked like Jack. Every message on the CB radio sounded like his voice. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My kids were worried sick about me, but I couldn't explain to them what was happening. How could I tell them that I was locked in a cross-country game of cat and mouse with a killer? It all came to a head on a cold night in February 2009. I was making a run through Northern California, up near the Oregon border. The road was winding through mountains, snow piling up on the shoulders. I was tired, thinking about pulling over at the next rest stop, when my CB crackled to life. "Breaker, breaker, this is Hitchhiker. Anyone out there?" I nearly drove off the road. It was him. It was Jack. With shaking hands, I picked up the mic. "This is Bluebird," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What's your 20, Hitchhiker?" There was a long pause, then his voice came back, low and menacing. "Why don't you pull over at the next turnout, Bluebird? I think it's time we had a chat." I knew I should keep driving, find a populated area, call the police, but a part of me knew this had to end one way or another. So when I saw the turnout, a wide spot in the road overlooking a steep drop, I pulled over. He was there, standing in the snow, just beyond the reach of my headlights. As I watched, he stepped forward into the light. It was him, all right. Older, more weathered, but unmistakably the man I'd picked up all those years ago. "Hello, James," he said as I got out of the truck. "It's been a while." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He smiled, a cold, empty expression that never reached his eyes. "Why does anyone do anything?" "Because I can, because it's fun, because this whole world is just one big, empty road, and we're all just passing through." I saw the knife then, glinting in his hand. I knew I should be scared, but all I felt was a deep, overwhelming sadness. "You're wrong," I said. "The world's not empty. It's full of good people, people who help each other, people who stop for strangers on the side of the road." Something flickered in his eyes then. Doubt? Regret? I'll never know for sure. Because at that moment we heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer. Jack's head snapped around, looking back down the road. When he turned back to me, his face was a mask of fury. "You set me up," he snarled. I hadn't, of course. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. But in that moment, I saw my chance. I lunged forward, catching him off guard. We grappled in the snow, the knife between us. I felt a sharp pain in my side, but I didn't let go. And then suddenly we were falling. We'd gotten too close to the edge of the turnout, and the snow gave way beneath us. We tumbled down the steep slope over rocks and through trees, still locked together. When we finally came to a stop, I was lying on my back, looking up at the stars. Jack was a few feet away, not moving. The knife was buried in the snow between us. I don't know how long I lay there, bleeding into the snow, before the search parties found us. They told me later that another trucker had seen my rig on the turnout and called it in, worried I'd had an accident. They never found Jack's body. The spring thaw came, and the mountain streams swelled, and any trace of him was washed away. Sometimes I wonder if he survived, if he's still out there somewhere. But mostly I think he's gone. It's been 15 years since that night on the mountain. I retired from trucking not long after, finally taking my kids up on their offer to settle down. These days I spend my time playing with my grandkids, tending to my garden, and volunteering at the local community center. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I find myself thinking about those years on the road, about the long, lonely highways and the secrets they hold, about the man called Jack and all the lives he touched. I don't regret the choices I made. I did what I had to do, what I thought was right. But I can't help but wonder about the cost, the sleepless nights, the constant fear, the scars both physical and emotional. And yet, for all that, I also remember the good things, the brotherhood of the open road, the kindness of strangers, the beauty of this vast, complicated country of ours, seen from behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. In the end, I guess that's what life is. A long haul through light and darkness, through joy and fear. All we can do is keep on trucking, eyes on the road ahead, always moving forward. Because you never know what's waiting around the next bend. It might be danger, it might be wonder. But whatever it is, you face it head on with courage and compassion. That's the trucker's way. That's the human way. And me, I'm James Jones, 68 years old. And this is my story.